Dr. Lawrence Krauss, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Man, I'm really excited. You have been, I don't want to say hero. I don't like heroes. Because everyone, they say heroes disappoint and all that. But I will say intellectually, absolute, just titan for me. So I've been following your work since I was at least 15, 17 years.
Yeah.
A very long time.
Oh, well, that's good. So as long as you didn't say since you were a kid, because that always makes me feel old.
No. But you've been instrumental in my thinking. I've always been a huge proponent of science. I love basic science. That's how we got connected, I think, was a thread about the woke infiltration of science and getting back to the hard sciences. So I really appreciate the rigor that you bring to, it's like a filtering mechanism for bad ideas, right?
That's what science is itself. It's a filtering mechanism for bad ideas. Really, that's the process of science, is to learn how to separate the good ideas from the bad ones.
Yeah, 100%. But I have seen this arc with the quote unquote new atheists, right? I feel like there was much more need for that type of engagement to sort of rebuff some unsophisticated ideas, maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 15 maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
And it feels like it's evolved. So what do you think? Because for me, the sort of debate about is evolution actually true, and is the Earth, the fundamentalist claims feel like they've been so thoroughly trounced that we don't need to really do
that
this
part
anymore.
of it probably not. Although I was just doing an event in New Jersey, and it was not clear to me that at that event they couldn't have benefited from some of that. But I still tell you the truth, I always had a problem with this term new atheist, because not believing God is not new, and I never could understand. People tried to explain to me what they meant by that, and I guess the idea is that atheists that were vocal if necessary. And you're right. I think in the United States, at least you hear less about young Earth creationism or intelligent design than you used to. That always worries me, because I wonder what's going on underneath the surface. But the willingness to believe things just for the sake of believing, because you want to believe, that's alive and well, and that's what I try and fight. And it's not all religious, or at least traditional religious. And so I think we all just have to question our beliefs, and that's important. And so I personally was never, my goal was never to. Again, I was attacked in New Jersey for supposedly doing movies to try and recruit atheists or get people to not believe, to leave Christianity. I never made such things. All I want people to do is think for themselves and question, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, and I think one of the hang-ups that people have is the fact that reality doesn't bend to your views. It doesn't care. It doesn't give a shit about what you think it should be and how it should behave.
The universe doesn't give a damn about us and what we want. It is what it is. And that realization is so important and so rare that we have to, and because some people find that disconcerting. And I think we just have to convince people that it's not. It's the opposite. It means the universe is far more interesting than we could imagine, and we should enjoy our time in it. But a lot of people somehow, the ultimate solipsistic and human endeavor is religion. The notion that the universe is created for us is just is so self-centered. There's obviously nothing more self-centered that some people find, after having grown up with that the notion that somehow the universe is not here for us, it doesn't care about us, and is somehow depressing. And you just have to overcome that and present it correctly and realize how lucky we are. This cosmic accident that resulted on this third rock from this relatively unimportant star in a remote location of a random galaxy in the middle of nowhere is just amazing.
It is, and it's mind-bending, and maybe this is why people default to religion. I think that there are some relatively easy answers that tend to comport with their experience, their classical experience, not the quantum reality of the way the universe actually works. And so I understand why people get caught up in that, because people like the concept. I love your book, Universe from Nothing, one of my favorites, because it always seems to be the core issue that theists, creationists will pose. Like, well, what do you mean the universe erupted from nothing? And all the beautiful complexity we see, like, it just absolutely breaks people's brain.
People seem to, people respond one way or another. I'm remarkably how much they respond.
Yeah, but so I think the key word there is nothing, right? And I think this is where you've gotten sideways of philosophers to some degree, and maybe some theists as well. Is like the definition of nothing. So I want to ask you, like, what is nothing?
Well, in some sense, I'll tell you, I wrote a whole book about it. So it's amazing how many people complain about the discussion of nothing without ever having defined it themselves. But whatever it is, they just know it's not what I say it is. That basically, but simply, it's the absence of something, right? And then you have to ask what's something, and that notion has changed. And I think that's really the hardest part for people, the idea that notions like something and nothing evolve as if there should be some absolute understanding. Well, that they evolve as our understanding of nature evolves. And so, as I try and talk about in the book, there are kind of three kinds of nothing, at least three. But the simplest version of nothing is just empty space, which, by the way, is pretty well the nothing of the Bible, for those people who don't like my definition of nothing. It's a vast, infinite void of emptiness. So that's one kind of empty space. That's one kind of nothing. A more sophisticated kind of nothing is no space and no time at all. Literally, no space and no time. And that's the kind of nothing that I'm essentially referring to in when I discuss the fact that our universe could arise from nothing. It's not that there was something else. It's our space did not exist. Everything we now see in our space and all the stuff within our space literally did not exist, and our space and time came into existence. And then probably the most extreme version of nothing is no space and no time and no laws, no laws of nature, and that's probably as far as I don't think you could do better than that in terms of nothingness. And I discuss all three in the book.
Yeah, and the question I have to theists or creationists or whatever you want to call them is how can you possibly define nothing when it feels to me like it's not a feeling, but by all of my understanding, and by the way, I'm just a lay. I'm not a scientist at all. I do computer science for a living. I'm not a cosmologist. I'm an idiot when it comes to this stuff. That's why I'm talking to you. The concept of nothing seems counterintuitive because nothing, the fact that something exists negates the possibility that nothing could exist.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very sophisticated idea, but it's hard to imagine because you have to remove things, and so that's why empty space is the easiest. But and some people think this is empty space here, but it isn't, of course, because it's full of molecules of air and oxygen and nitrogen. And it's all what's even more non-intuitive, but that's okay, because science is non-intuitive. The initial science was dealing with the everyday experiences, but we've gone beyond that. And so if it defies common sense, that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means our common sense is limited to our experience. But perhaps the most non-intuitive thing about nothing is that it's not so different than something. Namely, nothing and something could turn into each other spontaneously without any fancy supernatural shenanigans, as I talk about. And that, I think, upsets people more than anything.
Right. I think you have that quote that says that with quantum mechanics, nothing will inevitably lead to something, right?
In general, yeah. I mean, empty space is kind of unstable in general. If you wait long enough, things will populate it. At least can, because of the fact that due to not just quantum mechanics but quantum field theory, the unification of quantum mechanics and relativity tells us that empty space, these things called virtual particles can pop in and out of existence for very short times as long as we can't see them. And under very certain special conditions, virtual particles, which pop into existence, can continue to exist as long as their presence doesn't violate any known laws of physics like conservation of energy or things like that. And so under certain conditions, virtual particles can pop into existence and remain there, and if you wait long enough, under those special conditions will arise in certain places in the universe, and then you'll have stuff, and it'll pop out. So
right, and one of the things that blew my mind is empty space weighs something.
Yeah,
right?
well, it blew my mind when I argued it did, and it still is to me the most surprising thing I know about the universe is that empty space has energy. Not that it can have energy, which was sort of kind of known. It's standard property of quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, but the fact that it actually does have energy, and the energy it has is not too big to stop us from existing. Because if it was much bigger, we wouldn't be around. It has to be absurdly small, but it's not zero. And we don't understand the slightest reason why. Let me make it quite clear. It's the biggest mystery in science. And that's really part of what my book is all about. And it's a subject that's kind of near and dear to me for many reasons. One, because describing it could allowed me to describe the revolutions that have taken place in astronomy, physics, and cosmology over the last 50 years, but also because, I guess I was one of the first people to argue that there was indirect evidence that empty space had energy. And later on, when that was confirmed directly, it's surprising enough that it won the Nobel Prize. So.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't empty space responsible for like 90% of the mass of like,
well, the
in our
energy
bodies?
the energy associated with empty space is associated with 70% of the energy of the universe. The energy of the energy associated with something called dark matter, which is again different than anything that makes up this room, is another 25% or so, and 3 to 5% of the universe is made up of everything we can see.
Right, that blew my mind too.
Of course it is. It should blow your mind. I was going to say it's meant to, but it may not be meant to. But it is, and it is strange, and exotic, and fascinating.
Right. So my question was around, I think, the mass of the proton. Maybe that's what I was getting wrong. 'Cause my understanding, and like I said, I'm a complete dummy.
Most of the mass of the proton absolutely is the nothingness, if you want. Virtual particles are responsible for almost all the mass of the proton, and therefore almost all the mass of you and I.
Right. And so for anyone who might be wondering, like, when you say virtual particles may pop in and out of existence, like they actually are. It's like a boiling stew constantly, right?
It's not that they do. And even though we can't see them directly, and therefore it may sound like counting angels on the head of a pin, we can see their effects indirectly. One of the more clearest ways that we can see their effects indirectly is they affect the properties of atoms, the energy levels of atoms, which determine the frequencies of light that atoms emit. And if we don't include their effects, we get the wrong prediction for what the colors of light that atoms emit. If we include those effects, we get the correct answer to 13 decimal places. So we know there's no better prediction in all of science than that. And therefore, we know that they're there. We just can't see them directly.
Right. And so 13 decimal places is something like calculating the width of North America to like a hair's breadth, right?
Something like that, yeah.
It's fantastically accurate.
Unbelievable. It is the best prediction in all of science. There's nowhere in science where you can make a prediction based on fundamental principles and have it be correct to that level of accuracy.
Got it. So what exactly is a virtual particle? I guess I don't have the slightest clue what that really means.
Well, a virtual particle is a particle that in principle, it's a particle that exists, but it cannot be measured because its existence, as long as it's virtual, violates something like the conservation of energy. Here's the point. Like I used to say, and I guess I'm still saying it now because I'm about to say it to you, that quantum mechanics is kind of like the White House or corporate America. And I think it's okay to say we're filming in corporate America right now. If you can't see it, anything goes. and quantum mechanics is quite rigorous about that. If you can't measure it, then a system can be doing many different things, some of which appear to violate energy and momentum conservation, like particles can, in the time between you measure them, they can be doing many strange things, including traveling faster than light. And that's allowed in quantum mechanics, but it appears to violate what we can measure. And it turns out, it was really Richard Feynman, I think, who created this argument. It's where I first learned it anyway. If an electron is moving along and suddenly for a very short time, so short you can't measure it, quantum mechanics says it can move faster than light. Then if you measure it, of course, you find out it's not moving faster than light. But for the short time, you couldn't measure it. And quantum mechanics, by the way, let me step back. Quantum mechanics has this fundamental principle called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And it's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that says there are certain things you can't measure exactly, even in principle, certain combinations. If you have a finite amount of time to measure something, then you can only measure its energy to a certain accuracy. And since we all only have a finite amount of time to measure things, we can only measure energy to various accuracy. The longer we measure something, the bit more accurately we can measure its energy. And that tells us for very short times, the energy of a system can widely vary, right? If you only have a very short time to measure it, the energy of that system is uncertain to a large amount. It's so uncertain that it's an energy, the energy of the system is so uncertain that it can, that if you put two particles in there, and E equals mc squared, then the uncertainty is greater than the energy you'd get by adding two elementary particles. Okay? So nature says, okay, if it's that uncertain, for that very short time, you can have two elementary particles in there that then disappear, you know, and those are virtual particles. And while they're there, they're affecting things because they might have electric charge and other things. So in these systems, which empty space or even inside of an atom, for very short times, you can have virtual particles around, which means the energy of the system is wildly fluctuating. And it's those virtual particles that affect the properties of the system. They're virtual because, as I say, their existence is only allowed by the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. But it is possible, in certain situations, for virtual particles to become real. For example, if I embed an electron or an atom in an electric field, and the energy that a particle could get by a virtual particle could get by popping out and being real and being accelerated by the electric field, if the energy it would get is greater than its rest mass, then it could do that. Then it doesn't violate anything because there's enough energy stored in the field to basically allow that particle to exist for real. And so in certain situations and under high electric fields, you actually would expect virtual particles to pop in and out of existence. Similarly, in a gravitational field, if the gravitational field energy if a particle can gain enough energy by falling in the gravitational field of some object, like a black hole, and the energy it releases is greater than its rest mass, then near a black hole, virtual particles can pop in and out of existence. And it really was, a version of the calculation that Stephen Hawking did that first showed that black holes could emit radiation.
Right, it's the Hawking radiation.
And that's a kind of a kludge, but that's one way of thinking about what produces Hawking radiation. And so Hawking radiation is a form, if you like, of virtual particles becoming real particles.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Well, there you go. I'm here. My work is done.
Wrap it. No. I want to talk about weighing the universe. How cosmologists do this, right? Because this is another one of those things that sort of blows people's mind when you make a claim, I can weigh the universe. Like, everyone's like, how the hell you do that?
Well, we do it the way anyone weighs things. In a way, I mean, how do you weigh something? You see the effect of gravity, right? I mean, gravity is sort of weighing is kind of weird way to put it because weighing is kind of force, and we're really interested in mass. But we know if an object has a certain mass, what the gravitational force it exerts on other things are. So if you can measure the force, you know what the mass is, because as long as we know the strength of gravity. Newton told us, and I'll give an equation on your program, which maybe hopefully won't reduce the viewership, but maybe some of the people in your viewership will remember either happily or traumatically from high school that two massive objects exert a force on each other, force of gravity that Newton discovered. It's proportional to the product of the masses of those two particles divided by the square of the distance between them, Newton's law of gravity. And therefore, if I can measure that gravitational force, I can weigh them. I can determine the mass. If I have an object here and I measure the strength of the force that it feels, then I know its mass. Okay? Now, what does gravity do? Well, we know what gravity does for, say, 2 planets or a planet around the sun. That the force of gravity keeps the planet going in an orbit. It doesn't push it this way, it pulls it this way. Okay? And what does it do? Well, if the force of gravity was greater, then it turns out the velocity of the object going in that orbit of a given radius would be greater. In fact, it turns out those equations tell us that the velocity of a planet going around the sun is proportional to the mass of the sun. Well, actually, the velocity squared doesn't really matter. So the velocity is proportional to the square root of the. So when we measure the velocity of planets going around the sun, we can weigh the sun. Of course, we have to know the strength of gravity. That's the hard part, by the way, because how do you measure the strength of gravity between 2 objects of known mass? You know, because it's all right to say the sun pulls the Earth, but if you don't know the mass of the sun, you don't know. So it took a long time after Newton for an experiment to be performed that could measure the strength of gravity between 2 known masses, 2 cannonballs. And now in laboratories, with very precise experiments, we can measure gravity. It's still the worst measured constant of nature of any of the constants of nature because gravity's hard to measure.
It's the weakest force, right?
Yeah, it's the weakest force. So we can measure gravity to maybe 1 part in 10,000 now, which is pretty darn good. But we can measure the strength of electromagnetism, the strength of electricity, to 1 part in 12 decimal places. So the gravity is much less well known. But to at least 1 part in maybe 10,000, we can, or maybe 100,000 under certain circumstances, we can measure the gravitational force constant, the Newton's constant, we call it. So if I measure the velocity of a planet moving around the sun, and I know the strength of gravity, I can work out the mass of the sun. And with a single planet, I can get a number. But of course, it's even better if I have I used to be 9 planets, now it's 8 planets, because people got rid of Pluto.
It'll always be a planet.
It'll always be a planet to me, too. But anyway, if you fit all of them to a curve, obviously you get a better measurement. And we can use that to measure the mass of the sun. That's how we determine the mass of the sun, to better than 1% accuracy. We weigh the sun by looking at the velocity of objects around that. Of objects orbiting around the sun. And as I often say, and physics is like Hollywood, if it works, just repeat it. And so if it works for weighing the sun, well, we can measure the mass of our galaxy using the fact that the sun goes around the galaxy. We know the velocity of the sun around the galaxy, and we know it's distant from the center of the galaxy, so we can determine the total mass pulling the sun. And we find out when we do, it's roughly 100 billion times the mass of the sun. And that makes us happy because it turns out there's roughly 100 billion stars in our galaxy, so it all works out. And so similarly, on larger scales, we do the same thing. We measure the velocity of objects moving around other objects, not so simply sometimes in orbits. Sometimes we have to use statistics, but that's how we measure larger and larger systems. And we determine the mass contained in not just our sun, but in our galaxy, or in clusters of galaxies, or in superclusters of galaxies. We just use gravity. And then ultimately, on a larger level, you have to take into account the fact that Newton isn't exactly correct, as Einstein told us. And so Newton's law kind of breaks down in the larger scales. But what we learn on the larger scales is that mass bends space, curved space. So on the larger scales, we try and see how curved space is as a result of mass, and we turn out our universe is flat. On the scales we measure, it isn't curved at all, and that tells us how much total mass on average, more or less, is contained in the visible universe. So we use gravity.
Got it. And does that include dark matter as well? Mm-hmm.
Because dark matter gravitates. That's one of the reasons we know. That's one of the ways we discovered dark matter, is by discovering that stars moving around our galaxy were moving too fast. If you took into account all the mass of all the stars that should be pulling them in, they were moving faster than they should be, and the only way that can be the case is if there's extra stuff there that you can't see. So that's how dark matter was discovered, or inferred, if you wish.
Right,
it hasn't been discovered directly, but the existence of dark matter was inferred because not just in our galaxy, but in all the galaxies we see, objects are moving too fast.
Right. So you can infer you can look at the effects and understand that there's something there causing that gravitational pull, but you can't see it. It's not. It's like very weakly interacting. What is your intuition as far as us confirming the existence of dark matter?
Well, first of all, I should say it doesn't matter what my intuition is because the universe will determine it. But there are many simple. Everything we know about fundamental physics suggests that it's quite likely that there are other particles in the universe that we can't see. Our understanding of the standard model particle physics and its problems suggests that there are particles we can't. We know there are particles we can't see directly. We've luckily been able to measure them. Particles called neutrinos coming from the sun. There are 100 billion neutrinos going through every square centimeter of your body every second coming from nuclear reactions of the sun. They don't interact with light, so you can't see them, but we have detectors that can detect them. And in the early universe, there could be a large number of particles like neutrinos that could have been created, and so it's kind of amazing in a sense that there isn't more dark matter, that dark matter accounts for at best sort of 20% of the mass of the universe. But there are many well-founded particles proposed in the standard model and beyond that could be dark matter. We don't know if those proposals are correct. But the nice thing is, and I've worked, I'm happy to say, on all of the most viable possibilities to determine ways to detect them. One of the things I've done in my scientific career is work on ways to detect dark matter. And so I think it's not unlikely that we will detect it maybe in the next decade or two. That's if our simplest ideas are correct, which may or may not be true. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm less optimistic than I was because there is another way to detect dark matter, and that's to produce it directly in the laboratory.
Large Hadron Collider.
Large Hadron Collider. And so many of us thought the first things to be seen at the Large Hadron Collider would be these candidates for dark matter. Instead, we found the Higgs particle first, which is a big surprise, and we haven't seen the candidates for dark matter. Doesn't mean they're not there, and there's a lot of phase space still left to look for them, but it does dampen enthusiasm a little bit.
Yeah, totally. And I thought that we would, like you, I thought we would have already discovered it because it seems like when we've got a very solid theory, things tend to be experimentally verified if you have a reasonable, if the experiment that you're devising has a reasonable chance of success, right? So, for example, like gravitational waves, they turn that thing on like instantly.
Well, that was lucky, but yeah. Of course, the difference is that from a theoretical perspective, we were virtually certain gravitational waves existed. I mean, it's a direct consequence of general relativity, and we measured all the other things we can measure with general relativity. So there was no reason whatsoever to assume that gravitational waves didn't exist. The only uncertainty was, are there objects that are colliding out there to produce a big enough signal?
Right, because black holes actually have to collide to produce this, right?
But again, based on everything we knew about the universe, it was not unlikely that was the case. So that was although I thought the methodology of detection is so complex that I never figured we'd be able to do it, frankly. The motivation for it was quite solid. In dark matter, the motivation is pretty solid. And it's not, dark matter is not at this point required by the standard model of particle physics. It generally tends to be required if we extend it to try and understand how the other forces in nature may be unified. So it's highly well motivated, but I wouldn't quite say on the same level as gravitational waves.
Got it. Yeah,
it's more of a risk, but on the other hand, the detection techniques are probably simpler.
For sure. And so you mentioned the Higgs particle, and so that one, have they completely validated this? I get conflicting information because I thought that they detected the Higgs particle, but then they said, they had to revalidate or something like that. My understanding, like 2012 or something, is essentially when we detected the Higgs particle.
The Higgs particle, embarrassingly, appears to exist right where you imagined it would be with the properties you imagined it would have.
Got it. And so let's talk about the Higgs field. I think this is something that most, like the lay, person doesn't really have a good understanding of. Can you explain what the Higgs field is and how the Higgs particle is related to the Higgs field?
Well, in quantum field theory, in our fundamental, in the fundamental way we understand the laws of nature using quantum mechanics and relativity, it's called quantum field theory. Every field is associated with an elementary particle. Electromagnetism is associated with an elementary particle called the photon, which propagates, which is what propagates the electromagnetic field, that photons can also exist as real particles. So electric fields exist, and the right way to think about it in quantum field theory is that electric fields are really coherent superpositions of lots of virtual photons. So two electric charges repel because of the exchange of virtual photons, not ones you can see. But associated with virtual photons, there can be real photons, okay? And it's true and there are four forces of nature, and the weak force is another force of nature, and it's weak because it's associated with the propagation of virtual particles that are very heavy, not massless, like regular photons. So how can I say it? So the electromagnetic field and the weak force are two very different forces. One's long range, one's short range. But it turns out that the mathematics to describe it is virtually the same. But for some reason, the particles that convey the weak force are very heavy, and the particles that convey the electromagnetism are massless. Now, it turns out the mathematics is strange. If we just say, okay, we'll make a theory that looks just like electromagnetism, but we give these particles mass, the theory doesn't make sense. It breaks down. It has infinities. It doesn't work. It produces ridiculous predictions. But one way to solve the problem, and this sounds completely ridiculous, so ridiculous that I was sure that nature would come up with a different way of solving the problem. But one of the ways of understanding is, well, maybe these particles that are massive really aren't massive. They act like they're massive because they're moving through some background field, which we call the Higgs field, that is like molasses, it makes it, and photons don't feel that field, so they zip through at the speed of light. But these particles feel the field and get a resistance and behave like they're massive. Okay. Well, then the theory makes sense because these particles aren't, at a fundamental scale, aren't really massless. Aren't really massive, they're massless. But of course, that begs a question. It makes the theory make sense, but there's a big, big if. It requires the existence of this background field throughout the universe called the Higgs field, which a lot of people would say the solution is worse of the problem. You have to invent this weird background field. My friend Sheldon Glashow, who won the Nobel Prize for the theory that the electroweak theory, called the Higgs field the toilet of physics, because it's like what you never talk about. It's there, but you never talk about it. Well, but physics isn't theology, and you're not allowed to invent invisible things without being able to detect them, or at least proposing a methodology to detect them. You can't just create things that can, if they never can be seen, then they're not particularly useful. They may be true, by the way, but from a physics perspective, scientific perspective,
there's no falsifiability to it.
Yeah, you got to test the theory. So if the Higgs field exists, well, there's a particle associated with it. And as I like to say, if you spank the vacuum, if you hit the vacuum, if you hit empty space hard enough, and there's a Higgs field, you'll kick out real Higgs particles. And that's what the Large Hadron Collider was sort of designed to do, was hit empty space hard enough. And in this case, not empty space so much, but hit two protons together hard enough that you'd affect the space around the protons enough that you'd kick Higgs particles out. And lo and behold, in 2012, July 4th, 2012, as it turns out, much to the surprise of the experimentalist, I would say, who thought they'd ruled out the entire region that a Higgs particle could exist in. There was a narrow window that wasn't ruled out, and what do you know? That's the window. They discovered the Higgs particles were created that have the properties we would expect. And the weird thing about the Higgs particles is they couple to matter. The strength of their coupling determines the mass of the particle. Okay? And so Higgs fields get coupled to massive particles by a big number, and that's why the particles have a big mass, because they get more resistance when they move in that Higgs field. Particles we see as lighter have a coupling to the Higgs field that's much smaller. And some particles, like photons, have zero coupling to the Higgs field, and that's why they have zero total mass. And it sounds like a kludge. It sounds like a weird invention designed to solve the problem, but it happens to be true as far as we can tell. Now, we do not know, however, why the Higgs field has the properties it does. And that's an open question, and we are trying to understand that, and that's one of the things that the Large Hadron Collider is trying to resolve.
how is it trying to resolve that?
Well, first of all, by looking by understanding the Higgs itself to see its properties more carefully. But more importantly, we think that whatever causes the Higgs field to have the mass it does and the properties it does will lead us to understanding new physics, and generally that new physics will produce new elementary particles. So we're looking for basically the existence of new particles that betray the existence of underlying new forces that force the Higgs field to have the properties it does. One of those new types of forces is based on a new property of nature that some people have proposed called supersymmetry. And if supersymmetry exists, there should be all sorts of new elementary particles. And that was what many of us thought would be seen first at the Hubble, because there's not just one particle. So every particle in nature that we see should have a quote-unquote supersymmetric partner, heavier but nevertheless there. And if supersymmetry is related to why the Higgs field has the value it does, then the new elementary particles, the new supersymmetric particles, should have mass all around that region, which should all be accessible at the Large Hadron Collider in principle. We haven't seen any. But when I say accessible in principle, in practice it's hard to find them, and they may just have a mass range that's not yet accessible at the LHC. So there's still hope for that idea. Lots of phase space, actually. The simplest versions are ruled out, but there's hope that there may be there. So that's one of the ways the LHC is looking at for new physics that might explain why the electroweak theory exists as it does.
Got it. And what are the implications of this field of study, right? Because it's tough for me, being, like I said, a computer science and completely disconnected from the field. Other than people doing science, like basic research to find out how the universe works, I'm trying to understand, like, what are the implications of these new particles and fields? Is it
none? I mean, you're not gonna, well, I can say none to first approximation. It's not going to produce faster cars, better toasters, not going to make people money directly, likely, at least in all likelihood. All it'll do is explain why we're here or how we got here. And maybe that's not important to some people. But understanding how, when I say why, I usually mean how. How the universe exists the way it is and how it came into being seems to me to be one of the most noble activities humans are fortunate to. We have these brains, and it's amazing that we can ask the questions, and we're fortunate enough to try and get the answers. So it's purely an understanding of our origins and how the universe came to be. And if you think that's not interesting, then so be it. I say worse, not for you. I mean generally when I say I say it's worse for you. If that doesn't turn you on, the idea that we're on the threshold of maybe understanding how we got here, okay, then don't do it. Yeah, but I think it costs so little. It may seem to cost a lot. The Large Hadron Collider probably cost $10 billion, but in the scheme of things now, $10 billion is not a lot of money compared to the money we waste on other things.
Yeah, a lot of bombing people, right? Like
bombing, or I used to say it was the Xerox costs of the Department of Defense.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
We'll have Doge look into that one for us.
Yeah. Well, let's hope they don't think it's worthless. What worries me is what some people think is worthless may be a reflection of the fact that they don't understand what's going on. So we have a bunch of computer scientists go into in any field and say, this seems strange, we shouldn't fund this. Well, it may be, but perhaps we should step back and get a little more educated about what's happening. And much as I sympathize with the desire to get rid of waste, I also know that computer science nerds who are great at finding out what's going on are not always great at understanding what's going on, and that's the difference. And I say that to my friend Elon Musk, or my acquaintance, I guess you may deny we're friends. You have to watch out for the fact that often what you say is the intent of which may be accurate, may in fact not be accurate.
So maybe make the case, like, what does this basic research, like it's being done at LHC, how does that move us closer to understanding more about our origins? Because I think there's, like, to your point, there's very few people on this planet that think about the beginning of the universe, are we in a multiverse, like all these deep existential questions, and shrug and say, I don't give a shit. I don't know many people, whether they're theists, whether they're pantheists, whether they're atheists, like it doesn't matter. The people, it seems to have captured the imagination of every human on the planet. We all think about where the hell we came from.
Well, we all think about it at some point. They just don't. They're not paid to think about it like I've been, and I'm fortunate to have been paid for much of my life to think about these things. It's a privilege. It's not I'm not useful in that. I like to tell people that none of the research I've ever done in my life is useful in the sense of will produce technology necessarily that will improve our lives. It'll just help us understand how ourselves, and for better or worse. Philosophers get paid a lot less, but they, in principle, are doing the same thing, or trying to do the same thing, less effectively, I would argue. But if we want to understand the universe, the first thing to try and understand is what's the universe made of, and how does it work? And if we understand what it's made of and how it works, then we might have a better chance of understanding how it came to be. To understand how it works, you understand the forces in nature and how they behave. The electroweak force is one force. There's another force called the strong force, and then there's gravity. We've done a pretty good job of understanding three, although as we've just pointed out, even the electroweak force has a lot of open questions. Gravity we can't understand at all as a quantum theory. Some people suggest that string theory is a way to understand it. But ultimately, since gravity is a theory of space and time, we need a quantum gravitational theory if gravity is governed by quantum mechanics, and there's every reason to believe it is. Then only with such a theory will we be able to understand how space and time come into existence, whether there's virtual universes, virtual space-times that can exist, and as we think they should be if gravity is a quantum theory. Only if we fully understand that, then can we understand what the origins of our universe and its ultimate fate. And that's either a noble task or a fool's errand, depending upon, I suppose, your attitude.
Yeah, so I guess my question would be, all right, here, let me, there's probably a little preamble to this. My understanding of our ability to understand, there's like limits to it, right? Like you rewind the clock backwards to, you get to like a singularity as in claimed, the early inflationary period of the universe. You can only go so far. This is like the falsifiability problem of like multiverse theories. Like you can't directly,
We can, what we can do is we can have theories of the universe and look for remnants that may give us some clue, some falsifiability for our ideas. One of them is gravitational waves from the early universe, which I've looked at and proposed and think it's a very important way of understanding what may have happened. There are limited signals we can look for that we know of, and there are limited opportunities to look for them. They're very difficult. But in order to see if we can even find them, we have to think about what they are and how to detect them. But right now, you're right. Almost anything goes when it comes to the origin of the universe because our theories don't work all the way back, and our experiments can only test the universe. Right now, directly, we can probe the universe back, get with our current technology back to maybe a millionth of a second after the Big Bang. That may sound pretty early, but if we want to understand those earliest processes, we're off by 15 orders of magnitude. We have a long way to go.
Right, and things start to break down at a certain point, right? Laws of physics, they just stop.
Well, the laws of general relativity, the laws of gravity and quantum mechanics break down at a time scale of about a millionth of a billionth, well, actually, a billionth of a billionth of a billionth of a billionth of a second after the Big Bang. For all earlier times, the laws of physics, namely general relativity as we understand it, doesn't allow us to directly address what's happening.
Got it. So I guess my question is, how does this basic research inform our gaps about those big questions, right? Like what banged? What is the Big Bang?
Well, the basic research doesn't yet. I mean, our research in string theory may, but our understanding of the electroweak theory, science proceeds in baby steps. Mm-hmm. And it's quite likely it may not, someone may come along with a great idea and solve everything, but great ideas come along very rarely. So it's better to be governed by the experiment. And our understanding of how the electroweak theory works may give us evidence for trying to understand how to unify the forces in nature. If we can unify the other forces in nature with the electroweak theory, that'll give us a better handle on gravity. And if we have a better handle on gravity, then we'll understand the beginning. It's baby steps. You know, you do what you can do. And that's what we can do right now.
Got it. Because I think this is the thing everybody gets hung up on, particularly the creationists, is they want to know, and maybe it's even a nonsensical question, like what happened before the Big Bang, right?
Yeah, well,
like,
that question may be a nonsensical question, as Stephen Hawking would say often, is it just doesn't mean anything because if time and space began with the Big Bang, then before the Big Bang has no meaning. There was no before. But that's worrisome, right? Because if there was, physics for many people proceeds by cause and effect. If there's an effect, you think there's a cause, but if there's no before, how can you? And that means, that addresses lots of issues that require us to rethink what we mean when we think of such things, and may require us to change our language and our thinking, and even our fundamental ideas of physics. It's all up for grabs at that point.
Yeah, because this is where my brain starts to break, because you want to continue linearly in reverse in sort of because one can conceptualize a multiverse where our universe, our flat, architected universe exists in this pool of other universes. But I don't understand how time and space can be conceptualized, or even like.
Well, if you did, then you might be doing. None of us understand it. That's where you say your brain breaks down. That's the limits of. For those of us working at physics at the forefront, that's what every day our brains break down, and we try and use nature to help our brains a little bit to figure out how to get around that breakdown. And it's hard. It's tough going, and the fact that it's slow going is not surprising because, first of all, the low-hanging fruit was all obtained, and it's harder and harder and harder. But, we try, we do what we can do, and we go in most days and we fail, and that's just what it's like. My daughter used to say, who's here and we were filming in Nashville and with my grandson, used to say when she was just a little bit older than he is now, a few years older, when they were asked what her father did for a living, she said he looks at a blank piece of paper. Which in the old days I used to do before computers. Now I look at a blank computer screen, but anyway.
Well, that's a really interesting insight, because I think some of the, I don't want to say drama, maybe drama is the right word, that's going on in, the fact that there hasn't been any real material gains in science, right? The string theorists.
Well, and saying there's no material gains in science is a big step.
Sorry, physics. Let's say standard model hasn't been updated.
Yeah, even in physics there have been huge gains. Okay, so it's not a theory of everything is not a theory of everything. It's a theory of very little. Actually, is what happened at the beginning of Big Bang and the end of black holes. But the fact that there have been no material gains since the discovery of the Higgs, which itself was already kind of predicted, is a cause of concern for many people, if that's what you want to say. And it is. It's a cause of concern for me.
Yeah, I think the most vocal proponent now of this is Eric Weinstein, who has been very loud about...
Well, yeah, but Eric Weinstein isn't a physicist, so...
Correct. He's a mathematician.
I guess he is. I think what he is a talking head right now, and sometimes what comes out of that head makes sense, and sometimes it doesn't, as far as I can tell.
So that's interesting. So somebody who's on the outside looks at some of the claims that he's making, particularly about string theory, and I wonder, like, man, what's up? Is there
Look, I can't say I spend a lot of time dissecting what Eric Weinstein says, but what I've heard makes it clear to me. Sir, he isn't an active practitioner in the field, and his opinions may or may not therefore have any validity. And some of the opinions that I've heard him express don't seem to make any sense to me. Now, maybe I'm misunderstanding them, but I have better things to do than to spend time worrying about what he says, frankly. So, sorry. I mean, I'm saying sorry to him, and maybe I may be selling him short. But the few times I do hear him talk about things that I know something about, I question their validity. Let me put it that way.
Fair enough. And this is where being a layperson, it's so hard to understand what's true. There's so much money tied up in this. There's grant money. There's ego. There's people that want to have their theory be put forward and feel like they're being
it's
unfairly
hard. It's
gatekept,
true. It's
you know?
hard for people to when there's so much. The internet is great because it's a great source of information, but it's also a great source of misinformation. And let me say clearly, Eric Weinstein has a training in mathematics and therefore has the capability of understanding more things than some other people. But what we all have to worry about, including ourselves, is that we speak about things we don't know about. And when you get well known, and one way or another, for whatever reason, and I put myself in this category, it's tempting to start talking about anything. People ask for your opinion of anything, and it's really, you have to step back and say, do I have, I may have an opinion, but is it worth anything? And Richard Feynman, who obviously is someone I've looked up to for much of my life, said that. He found himself at a party once and talking to some generals about things, and eventually he was giving advice on national defense on things he knew nothing about. And that's when he said, hold on, I don't know, And we all have to question ourselves, okay? And so Mr. Weinstein, I suspect, while in certain areas his background allows him to have informed opinions, may sometimes be speaking about things where his opinions are not worth any more than anyone else's. And now, I'll say it may. I'm suspicious. I'm skeptical of everyone. And when I hear something that sounds like nonsense to me, I have a rule, one rule. I like to keep an open mind, but not so open that my brains fall out. And when I hear something that makes me think my brains are going to have to fall out in order to accept it, I'm highly suspicious. It could be that I'm wrong, but I'm highly suspicious.
Got it. And so let's talk about string theory a little bit. And I'm going to be completely out over my skis on this because I didn't know nothing, almost nothing about string theory. What's your opinion of it? Because it seems like...
my opinion of it, once again, I wrote a whole book called Hiding in the Mirror, which I recommend that you and everyone buys. It'll give you more than my opinion. It'll show you how motivated it is. It's very well motivated by the history of physics. I used to be called a critic of string theory. Well, I wasn't. I was a critic of the hype associated with string theory. I'm critic of hype anywhere, if I can help, including my own hype, if I'm lucky enough to be able to remember that I'm doing it. But string theory is based on ideas. Look, as I told you, gravity and quantum mechanics don't mesh. You put them together, put general relativity and quantum mechanics together, you get nonsense at some fundamental scale. Not the scale of planets or stars, but at the scale of the center of black holes or the beginning of the universe. Well-defined ideas in the theories that we understand, quantum field theory, led to the idea that maybe you could reconcile quantum mechanics and gravity if at a fundamental scale, particles weren't particles, they were strings, and space was kind of emergent. And it turns out strings weren't the fundamental ideas. Even in string theory, the mathematics got more complicated. And so it was well motivated. One of the requirements appeared to be that you had to have extra dimensions in nature. First 26, then 11. That number changes. Maybe dimensions don't even mean anything, it turns out. One person's four-dimensional universe could be identical to another person's five-dimensional universe. The physics could be the same. They manifest themselves very differently, but the underlying physics could be the same. It's a fascinating area. It's generated a lot of interesting mathematics. It hasn't resolved the fundamental questions it was meant to resolve. It hasn't given us a theory that explains the origin of the universe, or even why empty space has energy, or many other things. It has also predicted the possibility of extra dimensions that haven't been seen, and that doesn't mean it's wrong. Okay, it means it's an interesting idea and it's worthwhile exploring, but it hasn't yet done what it was claimed it was doing back in 1984. Okay, 1984. That's 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago now. It was claimed to be a theory of everything. It would quickly give all why we have four forces of nature, why we have three families of elementary particles. It hasn't done any of that. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means it hasn't done any of it. And it's still probably, in my mind, the best motivated proposal for trying to understand a quantum theory of gravity. But the wonderful thing about nature, I suppose, otherwise everyone's theory would be correct, is that most ideas are wrong. I can say that as a physicist who's throughout his career, most of my ideas have been wrong. Not because they're mathematically wrong. I've made mistakes, although I do that every now and then too. It's that nature hasn't adopted them. And, you know, and so if you had to bet, is this a priori, if you had to bet, is this idea correct? The smart money's on no. No matter what the idea is,
Yep.
the smart money's on no. But this may be correct, so we'll see.
Is the problem experimental verification?
Well, that's part of the look. It is the problem. It's not just experimental verification; it's experimental direction. What people seem to think is that we theorists come up with ideas and we do experiments to verify them. It can be like that, but usually, almost all the time, it's the opposite. Experiments come up and they give us something that's puzzling, and theorists try and explain it. So we're guided by experiments. Some physics is an empirical discipline. We are guided by experiments. And so what the problem is, we don't have any experiments to guide us right now. String theory is a large extrapolation of theoretical ideas beyond what we've been able to probe. And you're right. Many of the ideas in string theory can't be verified. But I prefer to think of it as another way. It's that the experiments aren't there to tell us what the theory really is. Okay?
Got it.
And so I'm a kind of an old-fashioned theorist, and I've seen it. And when nature guides us, it often provokes our thinking. The imagination of nature is far greater than our imagination.
Yeah, certainly. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about you being in all these debates, in discussions with theists and creationists, and so I want to know how you got into that in the first place. I understand, being a scientist and wanting to talk about what's actually true about the universe we live in, but it seems like a very weird pocket that you've got yourself into, like quote unquote new atheist thing, right? Like how did you sort of enter that space, and what sort of intrigues you about those discussions? Nothing
intrigues me about those discussions, but I got into it because I was trying to defend the teaching of science in high schools. I got into it because there was an active effort about 25 years ago by well-funded groups to infiltrate the teaching of science in schools to introduce something called intelligent design. A vague notion and tenuous notion that allows you to argue somehow that nature has been designed by a divine being. So it was a way to input religion into science classrooms. And I wouldn't mind the input if there was any evidence that the input was correct. It's not I'm anti-God, although I sort of am. From a fundamental perspective, my bias is anti-God, but as a scientist, I'm not anti-God. But there's no evidence for it. And so, and biologists who were the one, so this was attacking the teaching of evolution in high schools. And at the time, I had a somewhat high profile because of my writing, and also credibility because of my science, I hope to think. But I didn't think the biologists were doing a very good job at defending biology. It wasn't just an attack on biology, it was an attack on science. So I got involved because it was an attack on science, and I felt someone should speak up. And in my life, for better or worse, when things are attacked, I feel I should speak up. It's caused me immense problems in my life in one way or another. It's not something that makes me particularly virtuous. It's just the way I'm built. If people are attacked, I tend to defend them, and if ideas are attacked, I defend that I think are worth defending. I tend to defend them, and if ideas are presented that I think are worth attacking, I tend to attack them. It's just the way it is, and so I started to speak up, and that gave me a national profile that I wouldn't have had otherwise, I think. And then it labeled me as kind of because I was attacking these misplaced religious notions, and I had to therefore debate some religious fundamentalists. I ended up getting known for that, and then becoming more involved and realizing in other ways how insidious even non-religious fundamentalism can be, how dangerous it can be. And when I got well known enough that people started making documentaries about me or others that I work with, then I really learned how insidious religious ideas can be, and I learned that when there was I started having discussions with a well-known atheist, a new atheist, Richard Dawkins, and we started having discussions together that got a lot of attention and interest and audiences. And then when people made a movie about us called The Unbelievers, that's when I really learned how insidious religion is. Not the fundamentalist religion, but just religion. And I was just at a ridiculous debate this weekend in New Jersey about which is better, secularism or Christianity for society. And one of the premises of the debate, the reason it was ridiculous, and I didn't get to enunciate it clearly enough then, so I will now, was that many of the people who so-called call themselves Christians aren't Christians. Why do people call themselves Christians? Well, in England, they worked it out. The Dawkins Foundation, when the English census for the first time showed fewer than 50% of the population saying they were members of the Church of England. It's a big deal. And the Dawkins Foundation did a survey of those people who call themselves non-Christians. Or no, call themselves Christians, sorry, not non-Christians. And what did they discover? They discovered that people that call themselves Christians, well, they asked them, do you believe in transubstantiation? Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe that? And they all said, no, 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 no. And they said, why do you call yourself Christian? They said, we like to think of ourselves as good people. But it's more insidious than that. I got letters from people after The Unbelievers came out, which showed big crowds of unbelievers, right? And from small towns in America, these people would say, well, look, I just so heartened to see that I'm not alone. I have questioned my belief in God, but I cannot tell anyone I've questioned it. Because if I do, they won't allow their kids to come to my house. And so you realize how insidious it is, because religion has gotten a monopoly on morality, where people who don't believe in God are somehow viewed as immoral. And that's the real problem. That's the real problem. I used to say, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, a study came out of college students and adults of labeling who you trust. And atheism at the time, atheists were on the level as rapists. Okay? Wow. So if you're on the level of rapists, it's easy to understand why you wouldn't come out. And so I think a friend of mine, a wonderful jazz pianist who I was seeing in New York, he said that the way he put it was that for many people, Christianity is secularism in drag.
Wow.
And I told him once I would tell it that. And I would give him credit for it. I think I'm not going to give his name because I don't know if he wants that much credit. Anyway, just the best jazz pianist I know in New York, put it that way.
So are those discussions like draining for you then? It's not.
Oh, unbelievably so.
Really?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd rather be talking about the universe and how wonderful it is than fighting misconceptions about the universe. And I don't do it. I don't know why I did it. I found myself in New Jersey. I tend to say no to these things nowadays, and I did it again, and I once again asked myself, why do I do it? I think I do it because I hopefully will cause some people, and I don't want to use the word wake up because woke means something different now. But I will hopefully cause people to. I like to think of myself as a teacher, and teaching is to get people to provoke people to think for themselves, and so that's why I do it.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting because I've watched you engaging in these debates, and you're obviously very lively, and you're obviously very passionate about it. And I get now that you're defending it, why it's coming through that way.
Well, there's no sense doing anything if you're not passionate about it. It seems to me.
For sure. But it's very interesting to know that you're actually drained by that discussion as opposed to energized by it.
I get when I'm doing it, I'm energized because I have fun being on stage, and I have fun trying to provoke people and get people thinking. And so the act of doing that is entertaining, I suppose, and is energizing. So I get energized in the process, but the notion of it is incredibly draining.
Got it.
And it's much less fun. It's much less draining than to give a lecture where I energize people positively. Let me put it that way.
Got it. And so, question: with the seeming evolution and maybe an improvement in the quality of the folks that might be on the religious side of things, has that changed the dynamic and the conversation for you at all? Because to me, as an outside observer watching this, it feels like they've become more sophisticated.
Well, that may not be good. They're always more sophisticated in ways subterfuge. So that's become better because I spend less time on that. But then it turns out that what's happens is that there are other forms of religiosity that also need to be attacked. And by religiosity, I mean believing things without evidence and having dogma and having heresy and all of that. So I get involved in those discussions.
You've just described woke.
Exactly. And maybe if it's okay to take a short break to either get a glass of water.
Yeah.
It's powered up or powering up.
So the question is, where the hell did we leave off before the little break there? So I think we were talking...
It was woke. We introduced... We went from the sublime to the ridiculous, and I talked about the fact that I've been fighting religiosity that's not the traditional religion, and I explained what it was, and you said that's woke, because I intended you to say that.
Well, I've been pulled like a puppet with
you thought you were in control, but you're just my puppet. That's right.
It's fair enough. So so tell me about the new religion of woke.
Well, I think like all things, like original religion, it was well intended. Original religion was intended to try and answer questions and organize society in a way that worked. Woke basically said, try and be aware of societal problems and deal with them. Don't close your mind don't close your mind to the existence of potential inequities, and that's of course that's a good thing to do. But in the process, what it has tended to become, I call it fundamentalist wokeism. It bears, in relationship to woke, what fundamentalist religion bears to religion. I mean, religion itself can be pretty innocuous in general. Everyone has, ideas about things, and it doesn't hurt so much. Like to take that Church of England. In England, it's become so innocuous that, no one notices it. But fundamentalism, which is a dogmatic view that we know the answers, there's three aspects of it. We know the answers before even asking the questions. We're right, other people are wrong. And the people who are wrong need to be condemned. Okay? And that's what I call fundamentalist wokeism. The notion, say, for example, that in every situation there's inherent racism, and that you can't argue with it. If you argue with it, you're racist. And it's based on the notion, sure, there has been racism, and in some cases there is. But it's extrapolated to this dogma, and the dogma is right, and you can't question it. And if you question it and you're heretical, you deserve to be, canceled or hurt or whatever else. It's not just, don't just take anti-racism. There's all sorts of examples of it. And the notion that, for example, because there are transgender people, and there are people whose gender expression is not associated with their birth sex. Some people like to think that sex is imaginary, but it's not. It's biological. There are two sexes. There are two sexes if you define sex by the terminology any biologist would have used, gamete size. Now, it's true that there are people who don't just have XY chromosomes, and but there are also people born without two legs, okay? But that doesn't mean humans in general don't have two legs, okay? So anyway, but even if you don't buy what I just said, what you should have is a discussion. But there are people who don't want to have that discussion. That's fundamentalist wokeism. The same way as you will be killed in many Islamic countries for questioning the Muhammad or the Quran, and it is maybe not just as immediately dangerous, but it's dangerous when it comes to the restrictions on living and thinking. And to me, that's what part of the main joy of living is, to be able to think and enjoy the experience of being human in all of its aspects. And anything that interferes with that is something that I guess I like to fight. And so fundamentalist wokeism is something I've been fighting, dogmatic views that cannot be debated. And one of the ways to fight it is to argue in favor, not just to argue that the ideas are wrong, and often they're often nonsense. And I have. Because in academia, the notion that academia or science is systemically racist and sexist somehow got it permeated after George Floyd, without question. And you have to question it. And in many situations, it's not. I mean, in all situations I know, it's illusory. And therefore, if you try to address this illusory problem, you address it with in ways that are harmful.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're right in identifying there's certain features of wokeism that map neatly onto religion, particularly Christianity.
Well, you know what I like to. Well, there's one that doesn't. I was just saying it again the other night. The only thing that fundamentalist wokeism doesn't have that Christianity have is forgiveness.
Oh, wow. That's actually pretty good, because you're right. Like, there's original sin. Mm-hmm. Like, if you were born into one of these groups that is perceived to have more power than another group, that you have that, you just were infected with this imaginary disease called whiteness or maleness or some form of privilege, and there's nothing you can do to get out of it. And
there's nothing you can do.
And you call
and anything you try to do makes it worse.
Right. It's called the Kafka trap. Right.
Yeah.
So Robin DiAngelo has been the big pusher of this theory, and Ibram Kendi as well. Where it's like, to your point, the claim is it's not an appropriate question to ask whether racism manifested itself in any given situation. The question is, where did it manifest? And they would give these thought experiments, like if you walk into a shop, a white person and a black person walk into a shop, and the shop owner goes up and greets the white person first. That is and that's manifesting in choosing the white client over the black client. But if you go to the black client first, just because the claim is that you don't trust them because you think they're going to steal from you. So, like, there's no getting out of this. And if you try to argue your case, like you called out, then you are labeled, you have white fragility, or there's some sort of defect of your character because you're actually, trying to have a reasonable, rational discussion about it.
Well, and there's a way. I mean, there was a way where it maps directly onto religion. I mean, if you don't like the analogy, where it maps directly onto religion, it's in the ancient times, the Inquisition determining whether you were a witch. How could you determine if you're a witch? Well, if you denied you're a witch, you're a witch. And I remember one way is they'd throw you into a well, okay? And if you floated and survived, you're a witch and you'd be killed. But if you drowned, you weren't a witch. So there's no winning.
Heads I win, tails you lose.
Exactly. And so that's part of the problem. But so I talked about fighting these misplaced effects, things that are imposed. But there's another thing that needs to be fought, and it's a particularly appropriate day because a group in Canada, the Free Speech Union of Canada, just went online today, and I'm the chairman of the board of it, which is to me a great honor. But I've been promoting free speech for that very reason, because the only way around dogma is free speech, and I don't mean just the freedom to speak. What I mean is the freedom to hear. That's and it wasn't Christopher Hitchens who first said this, but he's the one who first made it clear to me. I think it was David Hume who first said it. But that you hurt yourself if you restrict someone's speech you don't like. That's the speech you want to protect. What you do is hurt yourself, because what you've done is remove the possibility that you might learn something that would explain to you you're wrong. So you've limited your own options for learning. And so the real reason that free speech is, again, if you want to think about it, is not necessarily an altruistic one. It's a selfish one, which is, I want to have the right to learn when I'm wrong. But anyway, it has to be fought in all of its ways, whether it's religious or not, whether it's politically correct or not. But let me say, having said that, I should alienate everyone, not just some people. The approach which is being taken by a lot of the right now to somehow impose free speech is to instead impose another kind of speech. So the current administration is seemingly trying to get their way of, say, let's take transgender. So the nonsense was that if you said there are two sexes, you'd be canceled. And I've just, by the way, I've edited a book, which is coming out in July, called The War on Science, which 39 well-known scholars of all political persuasions, from Steven Pinker and Richard Dawkins on one end to Jordan Peterson on the other, come out attacking this sort of woke fundamentalist, for the most part, woke fundamentalism and academia. It's an important book that I hope people will read. But what and it talks about people who've been removed for saying they're two sexes. The proper approach for that is to say, no, they should have open discussion. But the approach of the current administration is to say, no, you can't say that there aren't two sexes. You're not allowed. As somehow that's solving the problem. And that's just, in many ways, just as bad as the original problem. So I want to, even though, and I know I get attacked for being, well, I get attacked for no matter what I say, but to make it sound like I'm supporting the current approach to resolving that problem, and I'm not. I'm certainly not, because it's just as bad. And I don't think legislators or legislatures should be in the business of determining what is or isn't said at universities. What they should allow is what they should do is make sure the universities are allowing anything to be said, and then get the hell out.
That's the way it used to be. Right?
It used to be that.
You look at UC Berkeley, it used to be a bastion of free speech, and now today in America, it's like the epicenter, it seemed, of that woke religiosity, the crusade against anyone who might challenge that orthodoxy, the new emerging orthodoxy of woke.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seemed that way. I'm a child of the 60s, so it certainly seemed like a bastion of free speech. At the time, if I was a conservative intellectual at Berkeley, I might have felt like I didn't have free speech. I don't know for sure. I'm willing to be skeptical.
Well, I think at least we agree the importance of free speech. I think you call out Jordan Peterson. I think he's been very vocal about this, and he's spot on, which is like, in order to be able to think, you need to be able to speak and exchange ideas with people openly.
Well, you can think, but your thoughts aren't particularly useful if they're based on stuff that's just wrong, which is one of the reasons why I fight intelligent design. Because ultimately, if it's nonsense, and by nonsense I don't mean I don't like it. I mean, nature tells us it's wrong. Then from that incorrect premise, you'll come up with conclusions that are nonsense and that are often harmful. That's the reason to attack the incorrect notions as being incorrect, is because based on that, you will rationally take a series of steps and come up with a behavior which is wrong.
Right. The point I'm getting at is that thinking, I've always thought of this, like, I'm in computer science, so maybe it's a little bit different, but I've always thought of it.
Computer science is, but in computer science you have the perfect thing. Garbage in, garbage out, right?
For sure, but what I mean is, like, thinking is a team sport. Like, if you are in a silo trying to think on your own and not exposing your ideas to criticism and peer review and somebody to say, hey, you actually are missing you have a blind spot here, let me fill you in. I think human beings are like the ultimate bio-distributed computational system. And I think few people understand the importance of that and how valuable that exchange, that free exchange with somebody who might push back against your ideas is.
No, it's you hit the key point, because it takes us back to the beginning of the first hour of our dialogue. Science is a team sport. That's why it works. People think Einstein did a tremendous disservice to science, because everyone thinks that science is done to these guys sitting in the room alone at night, and even Einstein didn't do that. When he was doing good science, he was in touch with all of the current ideas that are going on, the people involved, and science is not done in a vacuum. It's a dialectic. It's done as a team sport where things can be attacked, and if they're not attacked, that's a problem, because only then can you root out the bad ideas. And you're right, we're a bio-distributed computer in a sense, because each one of us comes up with wrong ideas, and the only way to find out is to put out those ideas in the public domain and be prepared for the sharks.
Yeah, and I think this is the piece of the wokeism that I take the most umbrage with, which is the not just, I believe your idea is wrong and here's why. It is this personal attack. It's the reputational damage. It's going after your employment and literally trying to take somebody out. So there's this chilling effect that's like, we're going to self-censor. We're not really going to say that. And I think as a society, if we don't have the error correction mechanism where people feel empowered to say, hold on, this is bullshit and here's why, we drift. And I think we've seen this. I think we've watched this pendulum.
It's more than you're thinking. I mean, it was pointed out at a conference I was at recently that, during the McCarthy era, which is you tend to think of as a time when people, free speech was limited in universities. I think there were something like 23 professors who were removed from their positions at Berkeley and in the whole country because of the communist scare. there's an order of magnitude more faculty that have been removed from the universities for contravening in one way or another, for being, accused by people of bad ideas, or being racist, or whatever, or inappropriate language.
It's damaging in a way that I don't think people who are not in the STEM fields truly understand. I think
that's why why we wrote this book. That's why I hope it'll have an impact.
So tell me more about that. Like, I think we're coming to the same conclusion here, but I want to give you a chance to articulate that because I want to make sure that I understand your intention.
Well, I have been because of the position I'm in, I've become I hear a lot of people talk to me. I hear what's going on, and I'm also in position to some extent to be able to articulate it in a public forum. And to give you an example, I'll just take a quick drink if you don't mind. This is non-alcoholic, in case you're wondering.
We're not partying.
No, anyway, unfortunately. No, anyway, so I wrote a piece, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago for the Wall Street Journal, of all places, called The Ideological Corruption of Science. Because I've been hearing stories about it, and I'd also been witnessing it. I saw colleagues. I saw what was going on, and I was in touch with the grant agencies. I've been, heavily involved in a lot of that for much of my life. And here is the scary part. I got letters back from faculty, emails back from faculty from around the country. A surprising number of those emails were from fake email accounts that have been set up by them people, because the faculty said to me if they use their university account, they would worry about their job. That sounds like the Soviet Union or Hungary before the revolution. That is scary when the one place you think there should be a free market of ideas. When faculty are worried about their jobs for saying they might agree with me, people don't seem to worry about disagreeing, but that's really, really scary. So I think it's important, but at the same time, you see, to get credibility, the public, it's the same intelligent design. People would hear someone who sounds quite well-spoken and well-intended, and that would be like, for them, he said, she said, right? Some intelligent design person, come on, hey, that sounds reasonable. And so, for the public's point of view, when they're not part of it, what are you going to believe? And so, one of the reasons I chose to do this anthology the way I did, first of all, I wanted to choose people from across the political spectrum, because unfortunately this supposed attempt to affect free speech is become a right-wing issue, at least to the extent you can define right-wing and left-wing anymore. But it's become the province of what you would call right. Even more so, perhaps the Republican Party has taken it on as a mantra, even though most of them aren't free speech advocates in a real way. I shouldn't say that, sorry, Republicans, but some of them aren't.
No, I'll say I think it's an absolutely fair categorization, and I do think that you're calling out something important, which is sort of this inability to figure out the Overton window anymore. Like, because it feels like you've been around a while like me, and you've seen this sort of linear move where both sides have sort of swapped, where the left was always anti-war, pro-free speech, anti-corporate power, and it seems like everything is just sort of morphed, and they've flipped sides now in a lot of these
that's why you don't know who's
issues.
who anymore.
Sure.
Without a scorecard, and there are no scorecards. But in any case, so I wanted to have the entire spectrum, so this couldn't be said, oh, this is a right-wing attack. But I also, and there are a lot of good people writing about this, but a lot of them aren't at universities. I wanted to have people who, for the most part, are in universities or their career has been in universities, because I didn't want it to be seen as an attack from without. There are a lot of people who have been attacking universities when the president of Harvard said idiotic things and eventually was removed. There are guys like Bill Ackman. I think it's Ackman or Ackman, but I think it's well-known.
Yeah.
And, some of what he said I completely agreed with, but he was attacking from the outside, and that's easier to do. I think it's important for people to see that people inside are concerned, and also to give the message to faculty who are largely either trying to avoid the issue just to keep their heads under the radar, which is most faculty, or are personally afraid of speaking out, that at least this group of some people who are well known and of some repute for the most part at least, are willing to speak out. Maybe they were willing to speak out. So that was the intent, was to inform the public, give them a chance to see the spectrum, and also to maybe change the dialogue inside. And I'm hoping it will. Obviously the context of that has changed with the new election. The book was written before the election, but but the issues are still there, I think.
They definitely are. And I think you call out something important, which is, I always wondered, is this why you spent so much time talking to Jordan Peterson? Because he was one of those people that he just like, I don't give a shit. Like he took a very hard stand and said, this is what I think. This is what I believe the truth to be. If it impacts my career, so be it. And he took it on the chin in front of everybody.
Well, he's taking on the chin in some ways. Yeah. Look, I talked to Jordan Peterson because I like to talk to people because he has a lot of people listen to him, and I like to have conversations with, even if I disagree with people. And there's a tremendous amount I don't agree with Jordan Peterson about, but it's worth having the conversation, I felt. And we did it two ways. First of all, obviously, his speaking out about garbage and the restrictions on free speech is something that we resonate with completely. I was also intrigued with some of the things, his idea. I mean, things I find interesting and not quite comprehensible, which is his religiosity in a sense. But
do you find that hard to pin down as I do? Because
Jordan is incredibly hard to pin down, because whenever you pin him down, I said it to him, so I don't mind saying it publicly. Yet I've said it publicly anyway. When I read Jordan, or listen to him at times, I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes from the Dick Van Dyke Show, which is a show that existed before most people watching this probably were alive. Still one of the best shows on TV, I think. The source of all wisdom. And Carl Reiner, who was the boss of the group in this, at one point says in the show to Dick Van Dyke, says, "What on the surface seems vague is in reality meaningless." And I've said that to Gordon. So the point is that I think, but you know what? We had the conversation because those conversations need to be had. And moreover, to not be too critical, or at least to say something positive. I first did Jordan's podcast before Jordan did mine. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've talked to each other on and off. I've known him for a long time. And in his podcast, I was amazed at how interested he was in asking me questions and learning. And that's a good sign for me. And if anyone's doing that, then they're on my good books, okay? The other thing I will give Jordan is that when you confront him and explain to him why what he just said is illogical and wrong, or at least illogical, he said, "Oh yeah, you're right." It doesn't always change what he says later on, but at least he does. So I found that both of those particularly laudable.
Yeah, and I struggle with him too, and I think he's an interesting character. And this goes back to that discussion about the human distributed biocomputer. I think that he brings an important voice, and I think he brings an important way of looking at things to the discussion. And when I've historically been dismissive of him, and because you know the way it is, like when somebody asks a direct question about something like an empirical fact, and he's got to go talk about levels of analysis, and I realized the more I read him, I actually went back and like I read Maps of Meaning, and I tried to understand his thought process, and I realized he actually is a really deep thinker. Like he's got some unorthodox views. I don't agree with a bunch of things.
He's very well read. He has certain biases. Mm-hmm. We all do, but he thinks about things. He thinks about things a lot. Some things more deeply than others. I don't think he's ever thought about climate change, in spite of what he ever said about it. I don't think he's given 2 seconds of thought to it, in my opinion. But he is. But yeah, he is a scholar of many things, and I think we have to accept that and realize that and appreciate it. And because he says certain things that are sometimes outlandish, it's worth having that discussion. Because once again, it gives you the opportunity to see if you're wrong. Not just always try to show he's wrong, but to see if he can convince you otherwise. And I think As you say, I think there's some things he's thought incredibly deeply about, and it's worth, but it's also worth having the conversation for more utilitarian reasons, which is that Jordan has a huge following.
For sure.
So it's worth having the conversation, because when you talk to him, you reach a lot of people. And because he has a huge following, it's good for you to have the conversation with him in front of them, so that they at least will begin to think about those things. So it's important to talk to Jordan. And as I say, I've enjoyed my personal interactions with Jordan, and we see him. And you know, a lot of the time, I think what he says is nonsense. I would just say it.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I watched his discussion with Richard Dawkins, and I kept running into...
I couldn't bring myself to.
It was a little bit difficult to get through. But to your point, I think his audience... He's actually who I was referring to when I talked about more sophisticated.
Yeah.
I don't want to say theologian. He's not a theologian. I don't even know if he actually believes.
Yeah, it's hard to know.
It's very difficult, right? But I think the people who listen to his material oftentimes may be like that cultural Christian, or like they might have a more sophisticated view. Like maybe this, the Bible isn't literally true. Maybe this is a, metaphorical thing, and we start talking about archetypes and Jungian stuff. Like, cool. You're essentially talking about psychology. You're talking about the utility of religion in society. I think it's a valuable discussion.
Yeah,
and I think that you could, if you're talking to somebody like him, who was actually, I was surprised in your conversations with him, how well he understood cosmology and, physics
he asked the questions.
For a layperson.
And that's what I appreciated. Expressing an interest is a good thing. And I think you hit the nail on the head. I think his religiosity it comes from his view that myths are a central part of the human psyche, which is potentially true, and therefore need to be understood if you want to understand the human psyche. And then I think he takes it one step further, saying the fact that they're part of the human psyche may have some cosmic significance, which I don't happen to agree with. I think if I were going to distill it and I'm sure if Jordan were here, he could tell me why I'm wrong maybe, but I think if I were going to distill his picture is that myth reveals something about the way the human mind works. Human mind... if you want to understand the human mind, you need to understand myths, and the human mind reflects a feature of the cosmos, and therefore may reflect some underlying meaning to those myths, which may be divine. I think that's fair to say.
Whatever that would mean, right?
Yeah, whatever that would mean. And I'm sounding like Jordan now. Well, maybe not, because I did it in less than 100 words.
Good point. No, I think it's a fascinating discussion. I wanted to ask you a question, because I saw that you actually were in a debate on the affirmative side about being religious in some ways.
You've done your homework, which I like in a podcaster. I try and emulate that. Okay, go on.
So do you have some sort of religiosity in you that you're aware of?
Well, we all do at some level. We all want to believe in, as Fox Mulder said.
Sure.
I have no need. It may be some people say it's a personality flaw. I have no spirituality, other than I get awe and wonder when I look at the Hubble Space Telescopes. But I don't feel the need. I don't feel something's missing by thinking there's anything more to the universe than that which physical reality allows us to detect. I revel in that. The reason I appeared on that debate is the debate was we're all religious, and they expected me to be on the other side, and some of my atheist colleagues were on the other side. I took the side I did, which is say yes, and I think the evidence is precisely the rise of wokeism, fundamentalist wokeism, because in the secular community, they still want to, our natural tendency is still to want to believe, and that's one manifestation of it. So to deny that we all want to believe is, in my mind, just manifestly incorrect. Science is a process which we happened upon that guides us, that is based on the fact that humans naturally want to believe, and it tells us how to overcome that. Individual scientists don't overcome it. The community does. And so that's why science is useful, because it overcomes that natural human tendency to want to believe, which I call religiosity. And so I thought it was just a done deal. I mean, it was easy. It was an obvious question to answer, and the answer is, yeah, we're all religious.
Yeah. So that was the outcome that I feared, and I'm glad you called this out, and this is one of the reasons why I'm a little bit cautious about tearing down people's belief structures, right? Like, even I get, like, science is a great corrective mechanism. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I think we might do well to consider the second order effects, right? Because you call out, you remove a belief structure. Like, if you tear something down, particularly something that's been so impactful on Western civilization, like, Christianity, and replace it with nothing, it's like that quantum mechanical problem. Like, things just start popping into existence, and all of a sudden you have wokeism that is using the same probably evolved mechanisms where these other religions sort of sprang from, and we've invented like this new one, and we don't know what that means.
Well, look, yes and no. Of course, practically, to some extent, that's true. I don't think so much. I think those things were always nascent. Look, when I've done the evolution debate, I would find that people on quote-unquote my side, the people who are cheering me on, had no knowledge of what evolution was all about. It was already for them a political stance. They had already had a religious belief in evolution that was every much as religious as the belief in evolution. And I saw that. I think this has been around for a long time. I don't see it as tearing down, or whatever. I think that's the word you used. I forget the word you used now. But as trying to tear down a belief system, I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to get people to think. So some ideas. So if you can get people to question their own beliefs, then yeah, some of those beliefs are wrong. But hopefully, what one hopes is that will cause them to become skeptical of all their beliefs, right? And psychologically, it doesn't happen. This belief gets torn down, and then this one becomes a cherished belief. But that's what science does. And as a scientist, I get trained. I'm still a human being, and I therefore have those biases. But you get trained, if you see this enough, to be more skeptical of things all the time, of yourself. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to teach, if I want to tear down anything, it's the wall that stops people from questioning their own beliefs, whatever they are. And so I'm not trying to tear down. I'm not trying to take people's religions away from them. I happen to think for the world's well-known religions that they're nonsense. But I want you to at least be able to think about the question. But again, what I'd like you to do is, once you do that, is think about the other things you believe in. And I like to do that to myself. And I'd like you or someone else to question me if I say something and say, hey, you're being dogmatic about it. So you're right, but I don't think I've heard that from. I heard that, in fact, the other night at this Christian versus atheism kind of discussion. I've heard it from, in a different context, from my friend, and she's still a friend, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was an devout atheist and now is a Christian. Her reason for being a Christian, for the most part, is we need something to counter Islam. It's a political thing, right? You need this belief system to counter Islam, and I heard that more or less the same the other night from this group of so-called Christians say we need Christianity to counter wokeism. Okay? And I think it's nonsense. I think what we need is people to be able is all ideas to be attacked, to be a free and open discussion with them, and we shouldn't refrain from attacking bad ideas for fear of what will come out of them.
Yeah, I kind of agree generally with that, although I think I've been more trepid, approaching it more.
I have no. Yeah, I'm a bulldog in a china shop. So.
Yeah, well, and I have not hugely a dog in the fight, but I have seen sort of what has sort of accompanied this decline in religiosity, and I do take very seriously Dr. Dawkins' work on evolution. And I do believe that religion is probably an evolved structure. There's probably some evolved utility with that, right? And so,
hey, religion. If religion didn't provide some useful, it wouldn't be ubiquitous.
Right.
Evolutionarily, our psychology is such that we're all religious. That's why my point of view in that debate was the only correct view, even though it didn't win the debate, because all the people didn't want to hear it.
Yeah, and so it's a question, I guess, when it comes down to it, for me, being an atheist, is like, well, it's the devil you know and the devil you don't, right? I think the features of Judaism and Islam and Christianity and Hinduism, like those are manifest already. Like we kind of understand cross-culturally what's good and what's bad about these things, and how to, like, maybe what the antidote to that might be. These newly emergent religions that maybe spontaneously emerge, I think we have less understanding. And as we can see from wokeism, it can be incredibly damaging for society. And so from just a utilitarian perspective, I look at these things a little bit like, ooh, I'm a little bit...
Yeah. Well, they don't have, on the other hand, they don't have yet the power structure. Well, they... You know, it takes religion time to get up the power. It took Christianity and Islam a certain number of years to get the power structure they have. So if we can start attacking them before, they still have power, but if we can attack them before they have a century or 2 centuries worth of ingrained power structure, then I think we're at least in better shape. Let me say, to be quite clear, once again, to alienate as many people as I can.
Let's do it.
That the wokeism of the left is indeed a threat, certainly, especially in academia. But I do think that traditional religion, particularly Islam, is a bigger threat.
Certainly. I think that's almost certainly true. Maybe not so much here. Like in America, I don't think that's...
Yeah, well, but the world is interconnected. And it's like, look, here, let me give you an example. My concerns about climate change, I understand. I wrote a book called The Physics of Climate Change, so I like to think I understand the general physics of it. There are going to be physical effects of climate change, but I don't. But those physical effects aren't going to destroy humanity, not going to end humanity. Okay, it's just not going to happen. Okay, but they're going to produce geopolitical influences, like people losing their homes, whole groups of people being climate refugees, perhaps, that are going to produce geophysical tensions that could end the world, because we have nuclear weapons and things like that. And I think that I tend to think that when you talk about, in this country, at this point, so fundamentalist Islam is not an issue. But fundamentalist Islam is in a bunch of countries creating huge issues. Those countries produce geological and geopolitical tensions, and those tensions produce potential threats that may affect the people in this country. So the world is interconnected, and just like society is connected to climate, so society so one society is connected to another in a world that's tied together by the internet and everything else, and commerce and weapons.
Yeah, for sure. And that, I don't mean to downplay that risk. Maybe I'm thinking more America-centric. And also I'm super interested in the STEM fields. I know we talked about this a bunch. That wokeism that we talked about, the degradation of the quality of science as being output. I think this is an existential risk that is seriously undervalued by most people.
Oh, yeah.
Because the institutions that we had in science, the ability for the public to trust what comes out of academia, what comes out of the scientific enterprise, basic research, is taken such a huge hit, whether that be what's happened at NIH with Dr. Fauci and the lies that came out during the whole pandemic stuff, like whether there's a whole bunch of you talked about Claudine Gay in Harvard, and there's all of these things where these really highly respected institutions, very, very rigorous institutions, fell prey to this thing like we have to have the certain number of representation in engineering, where anyone who has a basic understanding of psychology realizes that personality is such that it just skews more towards male, because they're interested in things rather than people. And this is something that could get you canceled.
It has gotten people canceled.
Yeah, like James Damore at Google. He wrote a very mundane, very vanilla, articulation of basic psychology, and he was completely fired from the company.
I don't think this case is settled. Some things probably skew male, some skew female. Certainly, if you look at what people choose to do, and not are forced to do, but literally choose to do, that's what's important. There are certain. It's obvious that there are certain preferences. It's a complicated thing, and of course, it's a distribution. So there's always it's none of these stereotypes are valid universally.
Yeah, it says nothing about an individual because, distributions, like they are more alike than they are similar, but the differences at the tail ends actually matter.
Yeah, that's the argument that's normally given, and I think to some extent it's true. I'm always skeptical, especially when it comes to social science, because it's very complicated. It's hard to do the good experiments, and there's so many variables that it's hard. Physics is easy. That's why I do it. Okay, it's much easier than biology or social science. And people think I'm joking, and I'm not. I think it's in many ways that's why it's been so successful. But it is. Look, anytime you attack the very basic framework of a field like science by saying some people by restricting by doing look, universities should not be democracies. They should be merit-based. I've been on the administration in universities. They shouldn't be run by votes. They should be run by success, by quality, and what comes out should be the best possible stuff. And that's just, in my mind, research institutions should be run that way. And anytime you interfere with that, you hurt progress. Now. And that's what's happening, but not universally. And so you might say it doesn't really matter because the good science is going to move to China, although it took China for a long time because it's not a democracy, and students don't learn to question their professors. They produce a lot of these talented students who come to the United States, and when I was chairman of the physics department, would fail as graduate students because they respected their professors too much, didn't want to disagree with them, and that's what, in science, there are no authorities, there are experts. That's a big difference. And, but China's evolving right now. So you might say, okay, well, all that's going to happen is that's going to be, and maybe from the point of view of the progress of knowledge, maybe that's not a bad thing if the epicenter of cutting edge science is no longer in the U.S. Or even Western Europe, let's say. Maybe in a cosmic sense, who cares? But the problem is that they're going to be geopolitical tensions that are going to cause havoc, I think. But since I happen to live in the West, obviously it matters to me that I'd like to see the best possible things coming out of where I live. Not so much as because I'm worried about, not so much competitiveness. Because one of the things that science has taught me is that science is inherently in the modern world, an international collaboration. The really difficult questions require all of humanity working together to solve them. And it's not just climate change, it's building a Large Hadron Collider or you pick it, the problems are hard. And good ideas come from everywhere. That's why I wrote a piece on being so upset that Russian scientists are now excluded from the Large Hadron Collider collaborations because of the invasion of the Ukraine, which wasn't done by the damn Russian scientists, many of whom protested against it. That's the kind of incursion of politics that should not enter into it. And unfortunately, it hurts the collaborations at CERN because some of those Russian scientists do excellent work, but it hurts the whole. Then those people can no longer be productive in their own country, and therefore they can't produce there could be really good Russian students who don't have the opportunity to be involved in cutting-edge research, which can then exploit their amazing talents. So it's a chicken and egg argument. It's really, really disastrous. So I think it's really important to realize that while we talk nationally, and as I say, I can, because I'm here, I can speak about things here and in Canada and in Europe to some extent. But it is an international issue that we have to address and not be myopic about addressing it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I guess the point I was trying to drive home is the incursion of things like racial and sex quotas.
Of course, look, I'm totally against. I've written about it. It's ridiculous. It's not only just overt discrimination. It doesn't even address the damn problem. First of all, it doesn't solve anything. It literally doesn't solve anything because it hasn't changed the number of people, basically the demographics. After I was chairman of the physics department in the 1990s, and take gender for example. I had, if we ever hired anyone in the physics department who wasn't female, I had to write a letter explaining why that was the case. That was 30 years ago. Okay.
Wow.
And so those protections were already kind of in place, and it hasn't changed much for a bunch of regions. But moreover, it doesn't even address the real problem. There is racism and there may be sexism, but let's take racism. It doesn't. The people who get hired at, when I taught Yale or wherever, you pick your university, and physics, there are so few jobs that the people who get hired are generally from elite institutions. And then they're as privileged as anyone else, independent of their color, shape, size, and religion. I mean, so hiring them, requiring, let's say you have to hire an African American, let's say, but that African American you're hiring is already, if you want to call it privileged, you're not helping the poor inner city. I taught in Cleveland, right? And I go into the inner city schools in Cleveland, they don't have textbooks. If you really want to solve the problem, which is as much an economic problem as a racial one, do something about inner city schools and providing them the resources to be able to train. Do something about safety in the inner city so that kids can go to school effectively and families can live more easily. So these are deep, and they're real problems, but they're not solved by requiring a certain number of blacks to be in the physics department or a certain number of women.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with postmodernism, which is really underpinning the whole woke movement, right? Because postmodernism makes a couple of claims. Number one, you can't know anything about objective reality, which is the most anti-scientific, anti-empirical claim that you can make, and that the only thing that human interactions are power dynamics between groups. And so they don't care about things like having rigorous scientific processes. They even go so far as to call things different ways of knowing.
Yeah, which is garbage. I have a piece coming out about that. I've written, there's only one way of knowing. Let me make it clear. It's science. It's empirical study combined with rational reasoning. That's it. Revelation doesn't give anything.
And they call that a white Western way of knowing. Yeah,
it's great. And, well, some people do. And let me make it clear. Indigenous societies have come up with knowledge, but it's all been the same way, empirical. It's science. I spoke in China years ago, although I didn't go to China for a long time, but I was fighting superstition in China. And I got really mad, I think it was China, there was a conference and someone got up talking about Chinese medicine. And I got up and said, there's no such thing as Chinese medicine or Western medicine. It's medicine. My friend Tim Minchin has a song called Storm, which you should listen to, where he says, someone who's sort of a new age person's talking about alternative medicine. And he said, you know what they call alternative medicine that works? Medicine. And I think that's the really important, important thing to realize is that, this postmodern notion that there's no such thing as knowledge is just, and I've, in fact, in the preface of the new book, and I've written about this, that's what scares me, because we used to laugh at it. I remember when I taught at Yale, science is up on the hill, we used to look down at the English department, which is full of deconstructionists, and laugh and say, that will never happen in science, but it's happening. And that's what scared me. The same kind of garbage, even the verbiage that we used to do in spoofs. There's a famous spoof by Alan Sokol in the 1990s about that he got in a journal, I think, called Social Text, where he used hermeneutics of quantum gravity and string theory and it was just gobbledygook, and it got into this deconstructionist, social sciences journal. But the problem is the gobbledygook he gave, I've seen that identical gobbledygook now in science things, and that scares me tremendously, because you'd think, I would have thought that science would be the one area that'd be protected from that. And we need to, and once again, it tells us that we need, I'm not going to say to police ourselves, but we have to check ourselves. We have to be willing to realize that nonsense is ubiquitous, and we all want to believe. And if we ever get rid of the mechanism of science, of open debate, attack, and checking with evidence, if we ever get rid of that mechanism, which has been happening, then you'll see nonsense begins to proliferate.
Yeah, certainly. And I think maybe the lay person might not understand how much the woke has infected the hard sciences. Do you have any examples of that? Because I've heard some of the horror stories of, applying anti-racism towards...
Well, look, I mean, there was a paper I like to make fun of. Well, there's a few. One was whiteness in physics is a problem. And it was a paper that got into a physics journal claiming that one of the problems was whiteboards. Okay, as an example of racism. There's a ridiculous paper by a young physicist who, by the way, got some award from the National Academy of Sciences for communication on white empiricism, arguing somehow, and one of the most stupid statements in the paper was all the same kind of intersecting axes of oppression, blah, 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 blah. But one of the statements was that Einstein's theory of general relativity implied that because of the principle of general covariance, that black women who were otherwise oppressed were equally valid ideas of the curvature of space-time, or something ridiculous. I mean, it was just I can't even make it up. It's so nonsensical.
That's what I'm talking about. And I've seen I can't think of all the examples off the top of my head, but I've seen this in the journals, and I've seen this in the request for funding that you have to include anti-racism.
Well, that happily is changing in this country a little bit. But here's an example that it was true. Not even at the highest levels, but California came out with a set of proposed standards in math, arguing math was inherently racist. That, for example, requiring the right answer was white supremacist. You couldn't make it up. And it's not only embarrassing, it's demeaning, because also it's racist. Because it also implies, of course, that if you're not white, you don't get the right. I mean, all of these things are demeaning. In the same way that requiring a certain number of women in a department or a panel is demeaning. Mm-hmm. I just did a podcast with my friend Cyan Bannister, who's a well-known venture capitalist investor. And she said she doesn't go on. I mean, she used to get asked to be on panels because she was a woman, or on the cover of magazines, and she wouldn't because it's demeaning. And it is demeaning. I know the same thing, because then when you're on a panel, or someone has a job, if you're a woman, and there's the perception that you're on the panel because you're a woman, mm-hmm. rather than because of who you are, or what you've done, it's demeaning to you.
Yeah, the truly qualified, rigorous, people of color or women, that is demeaning towards them.
Because there's always an asterisk next to their name, and so that's the real problem. Is that you don't help even them, because by this again, the intent is reasonable, but the application ends up being counterproductive.
Yeah, and this, I think, where the collectivism and the power dynamics between groups comes in, because the individual almost has no import, because this is a battle between various groups and who gets positionality and power and how the intersectionality plays out. Whereas you and I and reasonable people are like, we're trying to get the fucking right answer.
You're assuming we're reasonable. I'm not so sure. Anyway, go on.
Well, I consider myself reasonable because I consider empiricism really, really important. Getting the right answer is really, really important, because science.
Well, not getting the wrong answer is really, really important. I think that's what science is all about, is not getting the wrong answers. A set of well-defined techniques to ensure that the wrong answer is ruled out.
Yes, because these implications directly impact technology, health, how everything in our world operates.
Well, here's an example. I used to say the same thing about engineers, right? If you're an engineer, you don't care. They're building a bridge. You don't care who they are, what their color is, or shape, or size, or anything else. But in Canada, where I happen to live, there's a medical association called CanMed. They were having new rules for training doctors, and again, I quote this in the new book, but their statement was that when it comes to training of young doctors, that basically understanding issues of social justice and anti-racism was more important than medical expertise. Now, if you're a patient, you better worry.
For sure.
Yeah.
Like if you have a serious illness, you don't care. You want to have the person who's the most qualified, has the most experience, who can solve your medical issue, as opposed to some sort of social enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because for that same reason, and it would be laughable today. I remember when I wrote the physics of Star Trek many years ago, my editor used to say to me, one of the reasons that this would that I was surprised by its popularity in some sense, but she said, when the aliens come, people are going to turn to the scientists, because that's whether you like it or not, because they could at least do something, right? And now I'm not sure it's the case, but at the time, the reason people actually respected scientists, whether they liked it or not, is it produced results. It produced a society, the technology we live in, and therefore you could count on it at some level. And scientists were among the most respected professions, and it's less true now than it was before.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I want to talk about something that might be a little bit over the edge for you, but tell me if I'm going too far.
As you know, nothing's over the edge, apparently. Okay.
So can you see yourself partnering with people who are more, I don't want to say religious or spiritual in some sense, in truth-seeking endeavors, right?
I've done it my whole life. I'm sorry. There's this notion I'm somehow anti-religious. When I was fighting intelligent design in the schools, I partnered with a very famous Catholic biologist. When I wrote to the Vatican, when it looked like they were going to speak out about against evolution, there was a cardinal. I worked with a scientist, a biologist, Francisco Ayala, who was not only religious, he was a former Jesuit priest who was also head of the, I think at one point head, but at least on the Pontifical Academy. We worked for common goals, because well-meaning people, whether they're religious or not, have the same goals. I mean, and I know excellent scientists who are deeply religious. It doesn't bother me, as long as their religious notions don't get in the way of doing the right thing.
Right. Sorry, I probably clumsily phrased that question. I meant more in a joint exercise in exploring deep questions, right? So I'm gonna go a little.
Again,
I'll
let me
be more
just point
specific.
out. I'm going to interrupt.
No,
I knew I do it on my own program if people complain, but now that I'm a guest, people can't complain. But look, Jordan Peterson is in this book, and his piece. And we're talking about the attacks on science. The piece is deeply infused with myth and ancient discussions of religious and otherwise. Yet we partnered on trying to, I hope, get to a noble goal. Anyway, so go on.
If you couldn't tell from my logo, I'm interested in the psychedelic space, right? Which I believe is clearly a science, right?
I know. A lot of people try and convince me about the psychedelics. People have been trying to get me to do them for years.
That's what I was going to ask you, too. That was a secondary question.
Okay, you can ask for it. I'll give you my answer, but anyway.
You sound like you haven't done psychedelics at all.
No, I haven't done psychedelics.
And
I've done other things, but I haven't done psychedelics.
Fair enough. And the reason I ask...
It's only fear... Well... First of all, I'm going to answer the question you haven't asked. Why?
Saves me some time.
Partly fear. I grew up in the LSD. I had a lot of friends who did acid. I was with them. But also, I guess I just never felt like I needed to. When I'm writing or thinking about physics, I'm in a high, and I'm on a trip anyway. And I'd say I'm high in life. It's we used to say it, but I just never felt the need to do that. In the same sense that friends of mine or people I know who are into meditation. M. Harris saying
for sure.
I just don't. find the need for it. Maybe it made me a better person, but I when I'm in the zone, I don't need it. And I like to, when it comes to meditation, I always think of my the line from Woody Allen where he said, "I don't meditate because then I ripen and then I rot." But anyway, and that's the way I kind of feel. So, it could be a limitation to me, but there's other things I don't do. I don't bungee jump either, and but I do. I have lots of friends who highly describe how psychedelics have vastly improved their lives and can help you. I have little doubt that I don't doubt that their veracity in that regard. For them, it has had an impact. It's allowed them to see the world in new places, in new ways. And I just have a certain amount of time, and I pick and choose the things that allow me to see the world in new ways. And for me, it's reading and talking to people and thinking. But, there are places I don't go and things I don't do that may also help me, but I have a limited amount of time.
Yeah, for sure. And it's uncanny, because that is exactly the way I felt about it. For the longest time.
Then you took it and you discovered how wrong you were. Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. And it was interesting.
I have so many friends who tell me the same thing.
It's a ubiquitous sort of experience, and it's very interesting to me because I was raised very religious, and I rejected all that. I was very hard atheist, and I had a lot of childhood trauma, and I had a psychotherapist up in Seattle who dealt with, meditation. He knew a lot about psychedelics, and he couldn't recommend it, but he was kind of like, you might want to look at, Johns Hopkins University on their psilocybin research, and ended up going down that road, and it just completely obliterated my entire, It humbled me in such a way that I became completely open to a lot. Not the brain falling out of your head, but it's almost like being let in on a cosmic secret. It is like the universe showing you, oh wow, there's actually things that your waking consciousness isn't perceiving, and it's such a transformational experience. I know you've heard this a million times.
No, my attitude is I always like to take the difficult route. Why would I want to be so easy? I'd rather find out how the universe works the hard way.
Dr. Krauss, that is not an easy experience. I got to tell you that much. But it was very funny because I was watching Chris Williamson. He had Richard Dawkins on a live event, and he asked him a similar question, and Chris was like, "Why do you think so many people want you to try psychedelics, Richard?" And he committed to doing it. I'm not sure if he's done. Yeah, he did. He committed in front of the whole crowd that he was going to do it at some point.
I know why. I know Richard's a good friend. I know why I'd want him to do psychedelics, but it's a totally different reason for anyone else.
Well, there's a lot of people that would, and the reason I'm bringing this up is not because of my personal experience, or I'm not trying to make any ontological claims about the nature of my experience, but I have delved quite deeply into the scientific literature around psychedelics, which is emerging, right? Like we've had the Nixon
Again,
banned
I'm skeptical
everything.
of all literature, including scientific literature.
For sure, and I remain skeptical as well. And particularly, like when I discuss this, sometimes I'm always like, and I have to remind myself that I was on drugs during this thing. I get it. But the evidence...
I mean, I've done drugs. Let me make it clear, but I haven't done psychedelics.
Dr. Rick Strassman's work with DMT, and then you've got Robin Carhart Harris and Imperial College London.
Whatever, you can quote all the authorities you want. I don't know them, so it doesn't matter.
Not authorities. They're just experts.
Or scientific experts. I don't know the literature, so it doesn't mean anything.
It seems to be important. Let's put it that way. I don't know what it means. I still to this day don't know what it means. But somebody like you, somebody like Richard Dawkins, I think there's a lot of people who are like, man, I really love to see what those guys, after they return from the experience, what they might say about it.
And I know people who've done and find. Well, I guess the ones who don't think it had a big impact, I probably don't hear much about.
Fair enough. Probably self-selecting group. Well, if I had real evidence, it's hard. You see, you can't get such evidence because you don't know what if. But I know people that have done pretty well, as far as I know. I mean, I think Feynman may have taken. I have no doubt that he took psychedelics. I think he said it didn't do much for him, but he explored it. But I know he did all his great work with the fundamental. He didn't know he could do great work his whole life, but the work that we know him for was before that, and so he didn't need it to do that. I think he wanted to explore it because he was a very curious man, and So I think if there were real, I have to say, when I was a kid, and by kid I mean a graduate student, I was at a meeting in
La Jolla, and first time I ever saw the Pacific, first time I ever in a nude beach. But anyway, and I remember hitchhiking to go see the zoo in San Diego, and a woman picked me up, and it turned out she was part of Transcendental Meditation, TM, and that was just around the time that they'd start propagating this nonsense that if you did TM, if more people did TM, you could fly. Okay. And so she just came from a class of people flying. And I told her, I said, look, can I go see? Can I go watch? No, because if you're there, then people won't be able to fly. It'll ruin the whole thing. So I said, look, if you could take me to this class and I can see people fly, I will change the subject of my PhD thesis. I will work on this. And I guess so if I were convinced enough in some ubiquitous way or unambiguous way that this had an impact, I might, and I still might not, because you know what? I mean, I'm an old guy now, and so it may not. I may just be happy enough with the way things are, which is probably a character flaw.
No, I don't think it's a character flaw. I think people look at it a bunch of different ways.
I have friends of mine. I've had a lot of pressure lately, and maybe at some point, under the right guidance, I might. Anyway, I don't have any religious, like most things. I'm a vegetarian, okay? But if I'm in a restaurant, or as I was recently, a place with that it was impossible to effectively get a vegetarian meal, I had fish. I'm not religious about anything, so in that sense. So I'm not religiously anti psychedelics. I just like vegetarianism, I just don't feel the need to eat meat. So.
No, that's fair. And like my interest, like I said, is twofold. Number one is the experiential or ontological portion of it. Like, what is this actually giving you access to? Is it a region of your mind? Is it a different type of dimension? Like, who the hell knows what this actually means? Consciousness is a difficult enough problem with standard waking consciousness, let alone mediated by a substance, right?
Yeah.
But also the thing that's been fascinating is looking at some of the evidence, and it's not super well defined, but a lot of people in engineering spaces and scientific spaces that did those LSD experiments in the 60s solved a lot of hard problems that they'd been stuck on because of the way that the psychedelics...
you have to convince me that that's the case. I know of one, but I don't even think he. This is Kerry Mullis, who has won the Nobel Prize for whatever the technology. I forget the multiplication. In terms of sequencing, you have to take a sample and multiply. I forget the name. Anyway,
the PCR.
PCR, yeah, he developed that, and he was big on drugs. But I suspect he did it before that. But anyway, I hear these anecdotal claims, but I don't know any. I'm skeptical of the claim that they suddenly were able to do things. It's just like some people say when they had a dream, they woke. I mean, there's one Nobel Prize-winning scientist who said, understood the structure of benzene during a dream. And I'm sure when I have difficult physics problems, I've gone. I hallucinate in a real sense. My friend and I would say we're hallucinating. I mean, I would just start thinking of other things, or I'd leave the problem, and then while I'm doing something else, an idea would come up. So who knows how these things come up? And so maybe for some people, being in a drug-altered state does it, but it may be sufficient but not necessary, I guess is what I should say.
For sure. I mean, it probably isn't.
Yeah, sufficient but not necessary. Yeah.
Right. I'm thinking it probably is not going to hurt, and maybe it might produce a breakthrough.
Well, it might. Well, that's the question. That's for me. You said it might not hurt, and I guess I have to. I don't mind risks, and I probably take too many risks, but I have. But the question is cost-benefit analysis. Is it likely it might hurt more than it would help? And I have to be convinced. Not always, but I have to be convinced that there's a reasonable likelihood that it will be help more than it'll hurt.
Right.
Or that I want to do it for other reasons. There may be other reasons I want to do it, and I'm willing to be hurt. One of the reasons I didn't take drugs, I used to be a wrestler when I was, not the ridiculous kind of Olympic kind of wrestler, when I was a kid. And so I didn't even take drugs for a long time because my body was my temple, or whatever you want to say. But I really tried to be in the best possible shape. And until I eventually decided, hey, I wanted, I just emotionally wanted to have more to my life than that. So.
Got it. And also, I like to think of people, high-end physicists, like your brain is your livelihood. Like tinkering with it.
It is. To me, it certainly has. Yeah. I mean, it's. Yeah. So
There've
it's not like a pianist not wanting to do certain things with their hands, right?
Yeah, certainly. So no, it's an interesting topic for me, and it becomes like I think
my resistance is breaking down. So maybe we'll see.
I would love to see it, but
A lot of people want to see it.
Also, I'll be like the person that finally pushes you over the edge, and you do it, and then you go crazy or something. That's my fault.
No, I know. I suspect. Well, look. I suspect I might find it a neat experience, but I have a lot. The point is, I have a lot of neat experiences, and so there's some I miss out on, and I pick and choose. That's all. It's life.
Fair enough. I'm not going to beat that dead horse. It's
we already have a lot, so it's okay.
Yeah, for real.
No, but good. Yeah, okay. But I appreciate you trying.
It makes good content too. People like talking about it.
You could have solved the problem by giving me water that was laced, and then we could have had the whole conversation.
That would have been a fun HR topic.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, so since we don't have a God that's determining our morality and our political beliefs and stuff, how do you orient yourself? Because I know you're very opinionated. You have certain political beliefs, and I want to know like what informs those opinions. Like how do you? If I at all consistent, and I'm not always, what informs my beliefs, and I try not to have beliefs, is the evidence. I try to have to act according to evidence, and to be willing to change my beliefs, and I've done that various times. My natural look, we all have biases, and it's important to be aware of those. I grew up in Canada, which is a country where, because it's a parliamentary democracy, government isn't distrusted as much as in the United States. So I, a priori, happen to have less concerns about government being involved in things like medical care, say, than in the States. I happen to think government should exist to assist. Government is not the enemy of the public. Intrinsically, government is there to help regulate and ensure a society that meets the minimum needs of safety, welfare, education, health. Now, my views on that have moderated a lot in the last few years in certain ways, but that's an a priori bias. So, because I grew up in Canada, I automatically was on the left of the United States when I came in. Right.
So I'm traditionally have been on the left, but now many of the things I advocate, and I've often now called a right-wing pundit. I write in the Wall Street Journal.
Window has shifted.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I get called a Trumper all the time lately because. So, but I like to not be categorized. I hope I'll never be stereotyped in that sense because because there's no doubt that every political ideology is an ideology, and I'm against the word ideology. I like to think I can question the aspects of anything else, but by background, I've come from the left. But I can say that changed. My brother, who I'm sure won't be listening to this, was much more left wing than I was. Growing up, and now he's much more right-wing than I am. So, what can I say?
Got it. And so I guess my question would be, do you approach the enterprise of politics from an ethical standpoint or a utilitarian standpoint? Those seem to be the two tracks that most people sort of...
No, it's all too sophisticated for me. I'm just a physicist. Look,
Or does ethics
it has to be both.
Does ethics enter into the calculus at all?
Well, I don't know what you mean by ethics. I mean, that's an interesting question. Truth, I suppose, if I have an ethics, it's not truth, but not falsehood, I guess, right? Truth is an elusive thing. But I think it can never be either or. There are ethical issues and utilitarian issues, and in some cases one dominates over the other. So I certainly don't have any guiding principles except the ones I gave you. The willingness and principle to question myself and others freely, the desire that all others should have those rights, and the fact that the only arbiter of truth is evidence and nature. That's about as deep as I go.
Got it. And this is where it gets difficult territory to tread, which is around the domain of values versus the domain of facts, right? Like those are always the ought-is dichotomy.
Yeah, well, no, I said, yeah, look, I buy that you can't get ought from is, but my point, too much is given to that because without is you can't get ought.
Correct.
And so until you know the consequences of your actions, you can't determine whether those actions are good or bad. If you do, it's irrelevant. And I think if you know is and have a rational mind, you can come so close to ought that it may be, the difference may just be semantics.
Maybe.
I think what we have to do is constantly question our oughts.
I would agree with that for sure. And I think...
Well, it's right, so of course you should agree.
You're right, sir.
No, sorry. No, I'm not sorry, but go on.
I think far too few people consider the ramifications of government generally, what it is and what it does, and what they're asking government to do on their behalf. Meaning that if you actually want to be factual about it, you actually want to be empirical and talk about what happens in the real world, what you're saying is, I want a group of people over here to have the right, a unique right that nobody else has, and the citizens don't have, to initiate violence against somebody else for violating a dictum that we've, like the legislative bodies, where
it's
decreed.
It's the will of the vote. I mean, we have a social contract. In principle, well, part of it is against our will. We live in a society, whether we like it or not. You know, Rousseau was right. Man's born free, but lives forever in chains. We have to have some kind of social contract because we live with other people. But in a democracy, it should be the will of the electorate, a will of those being governed, to at least temporarily endow certain groups with the power to do certain things that other people don't have the power to do. But at the same time, that with recognition that if they abuse that power, they can be held accountable for it. I guess for what you're getting at, and my views have evolved on this. Look, I trusted government. I've always been in favor of certain, traditionally free medical care, things like that. But what I've learned, and it really has hit me over the last few years, is that it is also at the same time true that government, while its intent is good, often screws up. Partly because of elite academics who have a view of what should be done without really understanding the needs of the people to whom you're doing it. So good government should try and be sensitive to those needs and willing and in particular willing to change policy when it doesn't work, all of which doesn't happen. So I've seen, let me give you an example. I never liked Milton Friedman, but let me take a better economist. Not better, but one I might like better. What's his name now? A guy at Stanford. The point is, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. The argument is about minimum wage. I grew up, and I thought, Canada has a high minimum wage. In the States, I see waitress. My daughter was a waitress for a while. I see them, just earning nothing. Should be minimum wage, a guaranteed. If you're working, you should be able to, at some level, working full time, you should be able to feed your family and house your family. Oh, it sounds good, right? But then I learned from a friend of mine who's homeless that, for example, that used to be, that she said, her problem is that the minimum wage gave her a barrier to get any job.
Exactly. It does not guarantee a salary at a certain wage. It removes the ability for somebody who would voluntarily work for less. The bottom rungs of that ladder
and not only that, needs to, because they can survive for a day on very little. I was about to have a podcast, a woman who studied undocumented aliens, kids. And what's going on right now is tragic for them. But kids who come in the country as minors, unaccompanied minors, who aren't allowed to go to school. They need to work to live and to give money back to their parents and their families one of the reasons they come. But the only way they can do that is getting jobs having child, for which there's child employment laws, which you can't have. So they had to work illegally as underage minors. If we enforce them completely, they would starve.
Yep.
And so all of these things are not black and white. And while I am in favor of a social safety net for people. I certainly am. I understand now how things like minimum wage can put barriers to and then, there are other aspects of minimum wage but so it's not. I'm not as ideologically, if you wish, committed to minimum wage as I was, because I've now empirically learned some of the issues. But I think there's a simple answer that no minimum wage or minimum wage is the right answer. That I'm more skeptical of.
Yeah, no, I don't think there are simple answers, and I guess I approach this more from I'm more interested in the meta questions, right? I am an empiricist, and so when people make claims like, well, there's actually
when you say the meta questions, you're not talking about a certain software company. No, go on.
No, Zach, I'm not talking about your stuff. No, but I mean the questions of, like, for example, does a social contract actually exist? Well, no, nobody signed anything. Like, it's implied. Your consent to be governed is implied.
Well, you didn't get a chance to fill an application form when you got born.
You didn't. Okay. And so it sort of is an implied consent, which isn't real. It's not something that exists.
The social contract is enforced. You're absolutely right.
Oh, it's enforced for sure, but it doesn't exist like in the real world, like material sensual reality. It doesn't exist anywhere. It's a concept in people's minds that they assume to be there. They assume your consent, and also this concept.
Well, you don't have I want to parse this more carefully, so I'm sorry to interrupt.
No worries.
Although I'm not really. We don't consent to fall under gravity either. It just happens.
For sure,
okay.
but gravity is not a human endeavor, right? There's no ethical component to gravity. It just is, right? Whereas there are real world ramifications to government doing things, which is why I'm concerned with it. And the other ethical component, which you called out, which is like, well, the story we're told is that we elect representatives we give them certain powers, right? You can do this certain thing. But one of the illogical things for me that I always struggled with, always tripped me up, is that, well, we claim to grant rights to these third parties that we don't possess ourselves, namely the right to initiate violence. Like, I can't come and steal from you, but a government can tax and steal from you, essentially, right? So those are the questions that, as an empiricist, as like if somebody thinking about the real world ramifications, like are these myths, are these religiosities that we've erected and evolved over time, and are they valid to be challenged?
It's a good question. I mean, there's one place where I clearly take your point, and it's one where I agreed with Christopher Hitchens a lot. Christopher Hitchens' argument against capital punishment was quite clear. I think it's right. Government doesn't have the right to kill people. If individuals don't have the right to kill people, then government doesn't have the right to kill people. To take someone's individual life for a crime, and then there's the deeper issue of war, which is a different question. But when it comes to, so it's just the government should not be endowed with the rights to take human life in the society that it's governing.
Ironically, Hitch is where I first heard that argument.
Yeah, Hitch is where I first heard that argument too.
But what interested me about that is, like, I thought about it deeply, and I was like, okay, he's making that case in a silo around capital punishment. But when I thought about it, it's like every law that the government enacts is backed up by a threat of murder, right? Like, if you don't comply, like if you disagree and mean it, men with guns will eventually come and...
Not threat of murder.
Well, hold on. No. Let's walk through that in the real world. If, let's say, for example, let's make it simple. Something prohibited substance. I'm growing cannabis in my backyard. The government finds out about it. They will eventually send people to my home. Mm-hmm. And they will have guns and they'll have handcuffs, and they're going to try to tackle me and restrain me and throw me in a cage, which is an assault. I'm just peacefully minding my own business. If I try to defend myself from the assault, they will murder me. Like, every law has got that implied threat up to the point, like the escalation of force up until the point of murder in the real world. And like I said, Hitch is where it started, and I sort of like, I started thinking through this. I'm like, holy shit, like this in the real world has real world ramifications, and we've so accepted this sort of framework, like as a society. It's sort of polluted our minds. Maybe it's not polluted, but it's certainly infected, maybe like a Dawkins meme mind virus.
But if you go back, it's a good point. But you go back before guns, there was a threat that was somewhat similar, and actually usually much more effective. It still involved force at some level, maybe, which was ostracism. So tribally, if you violated the rules of a tribe, you could be ostracized, thrown out of the tribe. Now,
you die,
and that generally is much more terrifying than merely being killed in many cases. And so that certainly goes back. I mean, that's a central part of human history. Ostracization has become legitimized by force. And in fact, to some extent, that's what jail should be. To some extent, I mean, let me say, and ostracization was ideally why people were ostracized was that they were disrupting the common good. It was a utilitarian thing, not punishment, although it was effectively punishment. It was just a matter of keeping order in society. And I'm all in favor of keeping order in society for the maximal good for the maximum public. I mean, all these things they're all quite abstract. And therefore, I don't think punishment is the right answer. You're generally trying to separate out that to try and, but of course, then who decides what's the general good? And, you know, it's a much more, that's why I do physics. It's so much easier.
Yeah, I've heard you say that before, and I think
it's true.
It's probably true, because these are the questions that keep me up at night. But,
well, that's why they're not solved. If they were easy, they'd be solved. That's why physics is. That's why we've come so far. We ask the easy questions.
Yeah, fair enough. And it's interesting, the ostracism approach. It's reinforced a lot of things, not only governmental type structures in the tribe, but also religiosity. Because as you know, like if somebody does not bow down to the gods of the tribe, killing people is just the easy way out. I mean, it's kind of like the slow way to kill somebody, because typically back then, if you weren't part of the tribe, you weren't going to survive on your own. Your genes don't propagate.
Exactly, but it's that insidious, non-violent thing that I worry about more. That's what I talked to you about. It's the person in a small town in Southern America who cannot say what they want to say for fear that the people won't send their kids over to play with them, or they can't get a spouse, or they might lose their job. I mean, that kind of soft oppression is really worrisome. It happens in many cases. It happens to people who don't dress right. It happens to a lot. It's not just believe right, and it's part of the problem of a complex society. I mean, I first saw it in a different context when I was a kid, Sinclair Lewis, Babbitt. I don't know if you know the book, but I mean, that is the first time that I really realized I never wanted to be conventional, because conventional is a kind of handcuffs that just doesn't allow the kind of intellectual freedom that I find an essential part of life.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm getting a little short on time, so I wanted to wrap it up. But I wanted to ask you, what's next for you, and how are you approaching this pretty impactful shift in the world? It seems.
I hope to comment on it, live through it. I don't know what's next for me, which is always what keeps me going. I know I have many irons in the fire. The new book is a departure, and it'll be interesting to see the impact of that. As I say, I'm heading this free speech union. I still I'm involved in a few physics projects, believe it or not, still. But I'm also really heavily involved now in trying to help, because I've been involved in media to some extent, and both being in films and making films. I'm involved in a new project of producing and distributing movies and helping, to some extent, uncancel people. The new companies, more or less, we're running things called Forbidden Film Festivals, and we're developing new ways to distribute films. So I've been involved in things and seeing how the independent filmmakers always get screwed one way or another, and also trying to help individuals who for one reason or another have been canceled. So that's a project and so I like films, and I've been in fiction films too, and it's kind of fun, and then maybe my writing will, and I may be doing some writing, some fiction. I'm going to go back and do some history like I used to do. So I don't know. Anyway, it's just I like to plant a lot of seeds and see what flourishes. And my hope always is that I won't know what I'm doing 3 years from now.
Nice. As a ADD riddled brain, like that totally resonates with me, man. So
well, I'm fortunate to be in a situation where I can do that, and I realize that is also a great gift that I don't take lightly.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a massive honor on my part. I think you're doing great work. You've contributed so much to society and knowledge production, and I really am cheering for you from the sidelines and looking forward to your next books and next endeavors. So thank you.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the discussion. I didn't know where it was going to go, and I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks for letting me take a break in the middle to get something so I wouldn't faint.
Anytime. Don't want you
no,
fainting.
it was really fun. I don't know how other people enjoy it, but I enjoyed it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's all that matters.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.